Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the movie of What If Deku Could Breathe Bubbles. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Summary: Izuku sighed, and then realized he produced bubbles when he did that. The discovery made him giggle. Katsuki must have glared at him despite being half slumped in the water. Sorry, bubbles, Katsuki asked in an annoyed tone. Yeah, ooh, I sighed in. And it, just look. He did it again. Katsuki stared at him for a moment. The blonde just looked entirely speechless. So, Izuku sighed again, but this time he managed to force the bubble from his neck gills only. It tickled, which triggered another round of giggles. Oh my god, you're actually a fucking idiot. Or Izuku and Katsuki get kidnapped again. This time, they're chained to an anchor offshore, and given a week to get back to the surface before the quirk allowing them to breathe underwater wears off. But, when the quirk gives them more than they bargained for, will they even want to go back? Loosely inspired by this song. https://youtube.b/0hd94r6gcly. Please read the tags lesser than 3. I do not own the MHA, BNHA universe, only this original plot. Please do not repost my work. Posted 1/21/24. Notes: Hey guys, welcome. This one was certainly a passion project. I absolutely love merfolklore, and it was only a matter of time before I put my own spin on this trope. Anyway, content warnings. Forced, unwanted kissing as quirk activation. Captive, kidnapped. Lots of emotional hurt. Comfort here folks. There's a lot of hurt, but don't worry, there's a happy ending. Smut, but not like human smut. Like the merfolk. It's kinda detailed. If you aren't into that, or don't want to know, look out for the and skip the scene between the asterisks. Mpreg, you've been warned. Lesser than 3. Love you all. Enjoy. Work text. Izuku struggled against the handcuffs on his wrists. Normally, he'd easily be able to snap them in half with raw strength alone. But the villains had given him some ridiculously powerful quirk suppressants that also bottled up his strength and stamina. He was exhausted from just that little bit of movement. Quit wiggling, idiot. Katsuki snapped. I'm not going to sit here and do nothing, Kaken. Izuku snapped back. They'd been captured on patrol. Izuku felt pathetic. What kind of hero student is dumb enough to get whacked in the back of the head and taken prisoner on a routine evening patrol? They'd made it through their first year full of villain attacks, then spent most of their second year at war. Now, in their third year, they were considered the best and brightest. The best and the brightest, trapped. The hero world was ruined. Society had nearly fallen into chaos. The hero students who remained after the war were left to pick up the pieces along with the hero commission that no one trusted anymore. What a great way to show strength. Get captured. Izuku sighed. I am going to strangle you when I get out of these damn cuffs. Izuku, if you keep mumbling about your damn perceived failing. I was mumbling. You're always mumbling. It's fucking annoying. His tone had no bite to it. Actually, it sounded almost endearing. We're going to get out of this, got it? Okay, Kaken. After Izuku's little vigilante stint in the wild, Katsuki had really calmed down. Well, when he wasn't in a stressful hostage situation, or a hostage himself. At the very least, Izuku could actually tell. Now, when he was angry or just pretending to be brash for show, they'd managed to rekindle their friendship into something more genuine than just rivals or work competitors. Izuku switched to focusing on where they were being kept instead of his budding friendship with Katsuki. The only major thing to note was that they were in one of those large metal shipping containers. The whole thing was empty except for them and the ring they were chained to at the center, back to back. The container was old-looking, rusty, but otherwise unremarkable. They weren't moving, which meant the container wasn't attached to a truck, and they were in a set location. That would prove beneficial to anyone looking for them, though it didn't necessarily provide any useful information as to how they could get free. The large bay doors at the back screeched open. Katsuki shifted behind him, trying to crane his neck to get a good look. Izuku realized Katsuki's hero suit neck bracer was gone. They were both apparently stripped down to only a pair of spandex shorts. He had been so focused on getting out that he didn't realize they'd been disrobed. Ah, good, you're both awake. 2 figures approached. The voice came from the man on the right. He was much taller than his female counterpart. Izuku assumed these were their captors. The man himself wore what looked like a scuba suit with the top peeled down and hanging at his waist. He had a basic medical mask on in some vague attempt to hide his identity. Izuku didn't recognize him anyway, so it worked well enough. The guy held himself pretty confidently. And though he was masked, Izuku could tell he was smiling by the way his eyes crinkled around the edges. The woman wasn't masking her face. She had a bright grin across her lips. She had short cropped blue hair and little scales running all along her skin. She bounced around the man like an excited child, though she appeared to be in her early 20s. What the hell do you want with us? Katsuki shouted. Izuku winced a little from the sudden noise reverberating around the metal container. Ah, always so energetic, Ground Zero. I appreciate it, really. Now, you want to know why you're here, right? Izuku nodded. You're both here because I want to run an experiment. Katsuki scoffed. So you just decided to kidnap a couple hero students and, what, see if we'll tell you all our secrets? Oh, no. I don't want information from you. I want to see how you do under stress. You see, I saw what happened down here in the center of the country during the war. I was worried that the next generation of heroes might not be suited to take care of us going forward. So, in order to test that, I figured I would just run a live experiment. What? Izuku muttered. Yes, it's so exciting, isn't it? Now then, I don't think I introduced myself. You may call me Variance. I know what you're thinking. You really don't, fucker? Katsuki muttered his interruption. The villain didn't even pause. What an odd name, Variance. Why did you pick it? Well, I'll tell you. My quirk allows me to judge the probability of almost anything. So, if I were to say, toss you both into the ocean, I could accurately judge the probability of you drowning. That's oddly specific, Variance. The girl finally spoke up. Her voice was high-pitched. It grated Izuku's ears in an almost painful way. Thank you for noticing, Sea Snake. Judging the probability of 2 teenagers drowning is quite miserable. So, we're going to give them a fighting chance, right? Why don't you do the honors? Izuku was still wrapping his head around the whole tossing teenagers into the ocean thing when these villains just kept throwing curveballs. The girl, Sea Snake, scrambled across the ground towards Izuku. He kicked his feet to try and scoot away, but Katsuki and the cuffs holding them in place kept him from going anywhere. Don't touch me. You touch my nerd and you die, bitch. Katsuki barked, again trying to fight his way out of the cuffs. Oh, come on. I just want to give you a kiss. It won't hurt, I promise. Izuku shook his head as he leaned backwards. He had his foot up on the woman's chest to keep her back as she reached for him with both hands. Katsuki was bent around him, trying to bite the girl's hair to pull her back. He got a good grip on her head, but Variance grabbed Katsuki and dragged him back. That's enough, boys. The man warned. She's not going to hurt you, calm down. Izuku did not calm down. Even if she wasn't about to kill him, he didn't exactly like the idea of some stranger kissing him. Variance's distraction was enough for the woman to get both hands around Izuku's head. She put a death grip on his hair and Izuku cried out. It was muted a second later when her lips crashed into his. Izuku never stopped thrashing in an attempt to get free, but the woman was stronger than she looked. And Izuku was weakened by drugs. Her tongue thrust into his mouth and Izuku's whole face went red in embarrassment and disgust. He felt weirdly violated in a way he'd never felt before. But this kiss wasn't really a kiss. It didn't feel like a kiss, anyway. The woman was breathing into his mouth. Something sparked between their lips. Electricity. Was that her quirk? A sudden itch broke out across Izuku's neck and his tongue felt numb. She licked across his gums once and then dropped him on the floor. Izuku gasped for air. His lungs didn't feel right. It felt like he couldn't process air anymore. Like this air wasn't the right kind of air he needed. He was choking. What the hell did you do to him? I'll fucking kill both of you. Now, Ground Zero. Deku will be just fine, so long as we get him into the water before he suffocates. Now then, will you be more cooperative? The more you struggle, the longer this will take, and the faster he will drown on dry land. Izuku gasped, his lungs fluttering as they tried to process the dry air around him. He couldn't move or even lift his head. Without oxygen, his brain was mush and his muscles refused to listen to his commands. Fuck fine. Do it. Izuku couldn't see what was happening, but he assumed the woman was kissing Katsuki, and Izuku found a flutter of jealousy in his chest before the suffocation took over again, and that thought was left for later, when he wasn't starved of breath. By the time his vision was blurring, he could feel himself being dragged by the legs. A flash of blonde hair and red eyes went by his face, but he couldn't reach out. He was still cuffed behind his back. The splash of water struck him as odd, but in seconds, he was suddenly breathing. His neck was cold, like chewing on ice cubes in summer or putting a mint in your mouth. Regardless, he could breathe. Izuku realized he was actually laying on the back end of a boat, where the lower diving deck sunk under the water just enough to cover him up to the shoulders while laying down. The sound of a boat engine made him flinch to the side, only to crash into Katsuki. What the hell? Izuku rolled back, a bit shocked that Katsuki's voice came through so clear underwater. They were both chained by their legs, their heads dangling off the back of the boat that was now speeding across the surface. Salty water rushed past their faces, but Izuku had never felt so refreshed in his life. He gulped down the water, but not through his mouth. Wait, did he have gills? He felt something weird and moving on his neck. How he knew what gills felt like was a mystery he hoped to figure out. I don't know. Izuku finally answered. Katsuki glared up at the deck of the boat. The woman, Sea Snake, was wiggling her fingers at them from behind Variance. So her quirk makes you breathe underwater. I guess so, but we're also talking, which doesn't make sense. Water doesn't transmit sound like this. Izuku sighed out a few bubbles. You're an idiot. Kaken, think about it, nerd, we're obviously not speaking. Not any human language, anyway. Oh, he was right. Izuku's tongue felt really weird, and so did his throat. So, they were speaking some other kind of language. Maybe something marine. That thought was worrying, if only a little. So what's the point of this, then? Izuku asked as he struggled with the cuffs behind his back. Toss us in the ocean with the ability to breathe water, for what reason? He said he wanted to test how we did under stress. I'd call this fucking stressful. Okay, but that doesn't really make sense. I mean, sure, toss us in the bay, but once we break the surface we can just swim back to the docks. Look around, nerd, we're not at the marina. Wah. Izuku looked around, finding coastal coral deep under the boat. Shit, Katsuki was right, again. They weren't in the warehouse district bay, they were on the coast. They were far off the coast. Izuku looked back up as a clattering sound struck his ears with a dull thud. Sea Snake placed a giant anchor, well, giant for this little boat, between their legs. Of course, Katsuki growled. They're going to sink us. Izuku thrashed again. The boat came to a stop. Izuku tipped his head back. He couldn't actually see the darkened ocean floor below them. All right, boys, Variance called. His words were muffled by the water around him, but they were still clear enough. Here's the deal. Sea Snake's quirk lasts a week. You'll find it does more than just give you gills and the ability to speak underwater, but that will come in a few hours. For now, you're both going to be tested on your teamwork under stress. This guy should really shove his hand in a blender. Kaken, stop it. You're defending the asshole who's about to cement shoo us into the ocean. No, you're just being an asshole back. And it's annoying. Katsuki opened his mouth to reply, only to appear shocked at Izuku's quip. Variance filled the empty space between them. So, we're going to let you both sink to the bottom of the ocean. We're about 80 miles offshore. If you can break out before the quirk wears off, you'll be able to swim back to shore easily with the help of Sea Snake's quirk. If not, well, you'll either drown stranded on the surface, or the pressure at the bottom will get you once her quirk wears off. Anyway, time to sleep with the fishes, and hopefully, not forever. Sea Snake busily wrapped chains around their waists and secured them with heavy padlocks. The chains extended to the anchor, but their feet were left to free hang. She grinned wickedly and showed them a shiny metal key, then tossed it overboard. God damn it, Katsuki growled. His neck was craning to try and watch the little glint of silver as it traveled down, and vanished in the darkness. Wait, what are we? There was no chance for him to ask questions. Variance kicked the anchor overboard and they were both ripped off the deck and sucked down a funnel of water created by the anchor's descent. The journey was longer than Izuku thought possible, but eventually, they came to a jarring halt as the anchor thudded into the sand. The vibration of the impact rattled his skull in an unpleasant way. Izuku imagined the pressure down here was likely part of why that happened, and he was already getting a mild headache. Fuck, Katsuki was kicking his legs, trying to budge the anchor, but it was wedged into a rock just beneath the sand. It wasn't going anywhere. Stop thrashing, Izuku ordered. What? Katsuki glared at him. If you stir up the water too much we won't find the damn key. Katsuki went still, fear flashing in his eyes. Izuku took a few deep breaths and took stock of the situation. Visibility was minimal, though he could see more than he expected to, so the quirk they were under likely affected more than they could feel or see. Granted, Variance told them as much, so it really shouldn't surprise Izuku. All his training was keeping him outwardly calm, despite his insides being in knots. They were breathing easy, and if the villains weren't lying, they'd have a whole week before they needed to worry about drowning or dying from the pressure. They had at least 5 days before starvation would get to them, and both teens had enough muscle to maybe get an extra day or two past that. The water situation didn't seem to be a problem. Izuku could swallow salty water and not feel any different for having done it, so that was good. Nerd, Katsuki called after several minutes. Give me a minute. Izuku snapped. Fine, Jeesh. The first issue with the handcuffs. If they could get their hands free, they could wait out the quirk suppressants and break their chains easily and get to the surface in maybe a few hours' time once the drugs wore off. So, first task, find the key. Okay. Izuku opened his eyes. Katsuki was floating nearby with an expectant look on his face. Izuku could hear the grumbling going on in his partner's head. He'd be sporting crossed arms if they weren't cuffed behind his back. Okay, Katsuki repeated, annoyed. Step 1, get out of the handcuffs. Step 2, wait for the drugs to wear off so we can break free. I could have told you that, idiot. Yes, oh great explosion murder god dynamite. Please tell me how fantastic you are at planning and teamwork. When the hell did you get such a snappy tongue? When the world forced me to fight a war before my 16th birthday. Fair enough, Katsuki mumbled. So, what's the plan to find this damn key? It's mostly pitch black down here. Ooh, well, I mean our feet are free, so we can sift through the sand with our toes. That's really all I've got, besides just floating near the sand and trying to look for a glint of silver. I doubt it will shine down here, at least not unless it's the middle of the day. Yeah, I know. Look, I'll start looking around over here. Can you sift through the sand over there? Katsuki clicked his tongue and set to work without another word. The blonde paddled himself to the ocean floor and started to dig around with his toes as best he could. Izuku busied himself on the opposite side of the anchor they were chained to. Thankfully, the chain allowed for about 4 feet of slack on each side, which gave them an 8-foot radius to search. The key was heavy enough that it didn't appear to float off when it was tossed, and so it should be roughly in their reachable area or just outside it. They searched, swapping sides and positions, for hours. It had to be hours because the sun appeared to set far above them by the time they both gave up from exhaustion. Even with whatever bonus this quirk gave them, in the dark, the sea really was just pitch black. Izuku could barely even see Katsuki floating 2 feet in front of him. Izuku sighed, and then realized he produced bubbles when he did that. The discovery made him giggle. Katsuki must have glared at him despite being half slumped in the water. The chains were keeping them upright from the waist, so they didn't really have the option to float away, and their bodies were somehow neutrally buoyant after Sea Snake's quirk. Sorry, Bubbles, Katsuki asked in an annoyed tone. Yeah, ooh, I sighed in. And it. Just look. He did it again. Katsuki stared at him for a moment. The blonde just looked entirely speechless. So, Izuku sighed again, but this time he managed to force the bubble from his neck gills only. It tickled, which triggered another round of giggles. Oh my god, you're actually a fucking idiot. Izuku burst into laughter. His body rolled sideways and flopped in the water. Katsuki leaned his head back and groaned loudly. Oh come on, Kakin. Izuku kicked himself across the darkened water between them and grabbed onto Katsuki's leg with his own. To hold them together. I have to laugh at something or I'll fall apart. Get off me, nerd. Kakin. Izuku whined. No, don't do that. I'm pissed off. You got us kidnapped and sent to our watery graves. I didn't cause this. Well, I sure as hell didn't. Oh really? You're so damn sure you didn't slip up on patrol and get us knocked out? I'm damn sure, idiot. Izuku laughed again. Katsuki tried to kick him off but failed when Izuku managed to get both of his legs wrapped around Katsuki's waist. Izuku was now a flotation ring for the blonde hero. Really, Izuku? What? You know what? Get off me. I'm tired, Kakin. Izuku leaned his head on Katsuki's shoulder. The blonde growled. Or well, he made whatever the underwater equivalent to growling was. It sounded like a bubbling grunt. Fine. Katsuki glared at the anchor holding them down. Izuku wasn't lying. He was actually exhausted. They'd spent the better part of the afternoon and evening looking for the handcuff key. Izuku was starting to believe the key was just buried under the sand somewhere. There was almost no point in trying to find it. Once the drugs wore off, they would likely be able to break the cuffs and padlocks anyway. Searching for the key had killed time, but it had tired them out for little reason. If my estimations are right, the drugs should be worn off by the time we wake up. Izuku mumbled against Katsuki's shoulder. Are you as weirded out about sleeping underwater as I am? Not really. Izuku shrugged. Katsuki leaned back a little and gave him a weird look. Well, you know, back when I was out on my own during the war. As if I'd forget dragging your half-dead ass back to UA. Yeah, well, anyway. There were a few times I may have passed out while hyper-exhausted, and I did wake up once, having fallen into a rather large crater full of rainwater, choking. This is a lot better, though. A lot better than waking up falling off a building, for sure. Izuku. Katsuki's teeth were clenched. Why did you leave me? Katsuki whispered it, like he almost couldn't bring himself to ask it aloud. Izuku finally tilted his head to the side. Katsuki refused to look at him. His eyes were dead focused on the dark ocean around them. Despite the darkness, Izuku could tell just how intense Katsuki's eyes were. The blonde was scared. Izuku lifted his head, just a little. Leave you? I didn't leave you. Not specifically you. I had to. It was safer for everyone, or I thought it was. I wanted to protect all of you. Izuku sighed. I forgot you were just as strong as I was. Katsuki sighed. I deserved it, and worse. No, none of you did. I did. Izuku sat up straight, startled at Katsuki's outburst. Don't do that. Don't pity me. Don't act like you can just forgive everything so easily like you always do, as if it all meant nothing. We haven't even talked about it since you got back. Kakin, you apologized. What else is there to say? What else, Izuku? You can't just be fine after everything I did to you. You can't just go years without a single word and act like I'm not most of the reason you throw yourself into danger or run off thinking your life is worth less and therefore easily sacrificed. You cannot sit there and tell me I didn't ruin what little self-image you had. Are we really going to have this talk while we're 500 feet under the ocean? Yes, damn it. I'm not. Izuku shouted back. What? Izuku pushed off Katsuki's body and hovered in front of him. I'm not fucking okay. Alright, I'm not. Katsuki's body spun around a couple times, slowly, from the force of Izuku pushing off him. When he finally came to a rest facing Izuku, the blonde was frowning. I'm not just okay with everything. Did I forgive you? Yes, I still forgive you. But no, I'm not just fine with it. It hurt, more than you know. I was there. I was up there. I was on that fucking roof the day you. Katsuki looked away. I was alone. Everyone hated me. My own mother thought I was too fragile for my dreams. She still does. And even my heroes thought I couldn't do anything right. So yes, I almost stepped off. I almost took that damn swan dive. Katsuki. I almost. Izuku gasped. He wasn't sure he could cry underwater. It felt like a sob was caught in his throat. But maybe he could silently blame that on the pressure of the crushing depths they were trapped under. The greatest weight on his chest had just been ripped off rather painfully, and his mind and body didn't seem to know what to do with that. Hey, Izu, look at me. Look at me, hey. Right here. Izuku focused on Katsuki's face. There was worry and pain in those deep red eyes, but Izuku forced himself to stay focused on his friend's face. Good, just take a few deep breaths. Slowly. Good. There you go. Come on, come here. Katsuki kicked himself closer until they met in the middle. Their hands were still trapped behind them, so it was impossible to actually hug. But Katsuki managed to wrap an ankle around Izuku's leg and pull him close. Izuku tucked his head under Katsuki's chin and listened to his heart thudding away in his chest. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so fucking sorry for everything. You're safe now. I'll never let anyone hurt you again. Not even me. We're going to get out of this. You hear me? Izuku nodded, sniffling a little. Yeah, Kaken. Good. Now get some damn sleep. Izuku woke up uncomfortable. And not just uncomfortable from the fact that his arms had been locked behind his back for who knows how many god-forsaken hours. Uncomfortable in the sense that his body was incredibly itchy. His hands and feet were aching, bones and joints, like they just wanted to snap themselves off and fly away. His head was also foggy in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't quite the heaviness of a flu or head cold, but it wasn't like dissociating, either. It was like something had weighed him down and refused to push through his sinuses and release the pressure. Kaken, he groaned. The blonde mumbled in his sleep but didn't wake up. Kaken, Katsuki snapped up, losing his grip on Izuku and floating off in a spin. Shit, what? What's fuck? I feel disgusting. My joints feel ready to explode. Katsuki thrashed in the water, his body flopping around sideways angrily. What are you doing? Izuku kept trying desperately to stretch his shoulders out in some vain attempt to make the pain in his hands stop. But nothing was working. Trying to get my damn nog. Fuck. I think I got it. Izuku watched Katsuki thrash around in a weird sort of barrel roll until finally, his cuffed hands were in front of him. They were trapped under the chain cinching his waist. But at least he had his arms in front now. That looked heavenly. Izuku tried to replicate what Katsuki had done, but he was too exhausted and his shoulders were just too sore. Kaken, something's wrong. I know. That didn't help. I still feel like my legs are trying to crumble off my body. Seriously, the itch was the worst part. It was driving Izuku mad. He rolled his shoulders for the 5th time and tried once more to roll sideways and copy Katsuki's movement. It took a few tries, but he managed to get his hands in front of him. Weirdly, he didn't feel like the drugs had worn off yet. He could see the sun breaking the surface far above them. So it was at least 8 to 12 hours after their unfortunate dunk into the ocean. And yet, Izuku felt no stronger, nor was his quirk accessible. Kaken, something's really wrong. I know, damn it. No, listen to me. It's been at least 12 hours. There's no suppressant on the market with that long of a half-life. I can't use one for all. I can't even access the vestiges. Katsuki ground his jaw. His hands never stopped struggling with his bindings. I know. I can't use my quirk either. I'm going to beat those bastards into their damn boat engine with my bare fucking fists. That. Izuku choked on his own words. Pain short-circuited his brain. Izuku's body convulsed in the water and sank almost to the sand. He couldn't scream, no matter how hard he strangled his throat for the sound. Nothing came out. Zu, Katsuki called. Izuku. Katsuki grabbed his arm and pulled them both together after he locked his leg around the anchor holding them to the ocean floor. Katsuki tried to grab his face, but with both their hands chained around their waist, they were stuck floating and tangled together. Izuku suddenly had the desire to peel his damn skin off. The pain spiraled down his legs as the muffled sounds of cracks and pops started to fill the space around them. His body rolled sideways again, his legs kicking and flopping in the water. Every nerve ending in his body was strangled and electrified at the same time. Someone had wired a taser directly to his spine and his whole body was seizing from it. Izuku could barely crack his eyes open against the agony, but when he did, he could see Katsuki thrashing exactly the same next to him. His mind reeled backwards until he didn't even feel like he was inside his own body anymore. Everything started to wander away from him. The pain, the grinding of his own teeth, even the sensation of electricity coursing through his veins. It felt like hours later when he finally managed to resurface from the depths of pain and unconsciousness. He'd blacked out, that much he could tell, but for how long? Something felt different. Everything felt different. There was something bright and shiny on the edges of his vision, like he had a concussion or someone was trying to shine a light in his eyes. His body felt ripped out of its sense of time and space, unbalanced and off-kilter. But that odd sensation was forgotten seconds later when he cracked open his eyes to look around. He groaned and only dared to move his muscles gingerly, just enough to make sure nothing was broken. Kaken, he finally twisted backwards, still somehow neutrally buoyant, searching for his hero partner. Izuku found him, hanging upside down and unconscious. Izuku rubbed at his temples, only to realize he'd managed to snap the handcuff chain in his pained rage. Fuwa. Katsuki, Kaken, wake up. Izuku tried to kick himself towards Katsuki, which led to another revelation. He didn't have legs anymore. Izuku did not have legs. Izuku took in extremely slow breaths in an effort to keep himself calm. If he didn't stay calm, he would likely lose his shit. There was no possible way that what Izuku just saw in place of his legs was real. There was no way he had some kind of fishtail. That was insane. This whole situation was insane. Here he was, like 500 feet or something below the surface of the ocean, 80 miles offshore, anchored to the sand, and suddenly he had a damn mermaid tail. Okay, Izuku mumbled. This is fine. It's fine. Everything is fine. If he didn't think about it, then it wouldn't be real, right? At least for a while. That is, until he looked over at Katsuki and realized the blonde also had a tail. Bright red scales with a smattering of interspersed black ones trailed down from his waist to the tip of his fluke. How did Izuku know it was called a fluke? He wasn't sure, but he did. The explosive teen's nails were extended into black claws and he found his own were similar. Izuku noted there were spiky red fins or fronds peeking out behind his ears. They actually kind of mimicked a part of his hero costume. Wait, did Izuku also have that? He looked down at himself, spotting all the dark green scales that trailed from his belly down across his giant fish tail. There were a few silvery scales that sparkled between the green ones here and there, somehow catching the faint light from leagues above them. His hands sank into his floating curls, finding those fin-like fronds spaced out all over his head. He pulled one down and discovered they were also silvery white, to match his scales. He felt amazing, finally, after his bones settled into place. He felt good. He was, of course, still chained to a fucking anchor, but at least he didn't feel so shitty or even itchy anymore. Izuku yelped when he realized he'd forgotten Katsuki in his analysis of their new bodies. Kaken, he squealed, flicking his tail to send him careening towards his hero partner. He'd far overjudged that tail flick and ended up crashing into Katsuki as he tried to balance his new, weighty lower half. Shit, they went tumbling sideways, tangled in each other. Izuku pulsed his fluke, trying desperately to upright them, and eventually he managed it. They could only spiral around the anchor, and it was good they couldn't just float off into the open ocean. Kaken, please wake up. He brushed a hand across Katsuki's face and offered a few light smacks to his cheek. The blonde's eyes twitched and eventually cracked open. What the hell? He groaned. Izuku released him and Katsuki sat up. Or well, floated up. What the actual fuck? He was inspecting himself and Izuku and realizing just how different they were all of a sudden. I think I get what Variance meant when he said sea snake's quirk wouldn't just make us breathe underwater. You think, nerd? Katsuki flicked his tail, and just like Izuku, he misjudged it. The blonde went lopsided in the water and spun out on his 4-foot chain. Thankfully, he'd also broken his handcuff links and could stop himself by grabbing a passing rock. This is ridiculous. I think it's pretty cool. I mean, come on, how often do you get the chance to be a mermaid? Absolutely never. Why the hell would I want to be a fish? Izuku, and come on. You have to admit this is kind of neat. We can breathe underwater. And talk and well, I mean we have tails. All of which means absolutely nothing if we don't unchain our fucking asses from this damn anchor in 6 days. Idiot. Okay, Katsuki had a point. Izuku looked down at his fluke, instinctively. He was pushing it back and forth to keep himself upright. It was so subconscious an action that he hadn't even noticed he was doing it. The second he recognized he was doing it, his tail stuttered and took a moment to get a rhythm back. He looked down because it occurred to him that his fluke was perhaps smaller than his legs. Or rather, it tapered down a lot more than his human thighs and legs did. Izuku might be shy when it comes to romantic attention, but he was not stupid enough to ignore how people stared at his thighs. The swap to using his legs for his quirk had bulked them out, after all. That is to say, his fish tail was a lot thinner than his thick thighs. Sadly, despite his best efforts, Sea Snake had tied the chains too tight to push over the bulk of their hip bones. Actually, now that they'd spent a day thrashing around in them, Izuku realized the metal was cutting into the skin of his waist. The small store-bought padlocks would be simple to break if he had his usual strength, which he didn't. Izuku sighed. Well, we're not slipping the chains. I have a theory. Katsuki cut to a new subject a bit suddenly. Izuku looked up with a confused face but didn't complain. The drugs wore off hours ago. That bitch's quirk is what's making us weak. Izuku felt his eyes widen and his mouth fall open. Of course, this quirk changed their entire physical makeup. Izuku slapped a fist into his open palm. Gods, I'm such a moron. Glad we can finally agree on something, dumbass. Shut up, Kaken. You're missing the point. Then please, Katsuki motioned his hand wide, continue. We have all the time in the world. Izuku rolled his eyes. Her quirk completely transformed us into a new species. Our whole genetic makeup has been altered. No quirks, no crazy strength, we're just humans with fish parts. We're just mermaids. Okay, first of all, it's mermen. Secondly, what the fuck? Izuku shrugged. That was his best estimated guess. There was no way to know if Izuku was actually right or not, though he fully intended on making Sea Snake speak at length on her quirk when they got out of this mess. If they got out of this mess, frankly, Izuku wasn't altogether sure he wanted to go back to the surface. Maybe that was the quirk talking. Izuku sure hoped it was. Well, we can't slip the chains. And there's little hope of finding the key, and our quirks and strength likely aren't coming back anytime soon, so how would you like to kill the next 6 days, Kaken? Well, not starving would be a nice start. Right. Well, we're surrounded by the ocean. There has to be food somewhere. Fish, algae, seaweed. Do you see anything, nerd? I sure as hell don't. Izuku let out a frustrated growl and flicked his tail to propel himself into Katsuki's face. He managed it with only a little bit of sideways bobbing. It wasn't as intimidating as he wanted to be. Problem? Katsuki grunted. Yes, did you mean anything you said yesterday? You're being insufferable. And right now, being a cranky bitch might just get us killed, so could you please, for the love of every god out there, just try to be a team player. Katsuki crossed his arms, his tail flitting back and forth. It almost looked like he was awkwardly hopping from foot to foot with nerves like he did back when they were children. Shit, Izuku had gone too far, hadn't he? He brushed a hand up through his floating curls and tried to calm down. He knew Katsuki was just like this. His personality was brash and cruel. It wasn't like the blonde was intentionally being a dick, but that didn't negate the fact that it made him difficult to work with. If anything, it just made things worse to know it wasn't intentional. I'm sorry, Katsuki mumbled. Izuku tilted his head back down and smiled faintly. Can we please work together to get out of this mess? I'm tired of bickering. We've been best friends since we were born, and I want to rebuild that. I do too. Katsuki floated closer and offered his hand out slowly. Izuku took it and squeezed. Look, let's start over. Tell me the situation. We'll brainstorm. Okay. Izuku leaned over to thunk their foreheads together. Katsuki finally found that ever-present determined scowl once again. Well, get on with it, nerd. Katsuki teased. Yeah, alright, so, we're civilians now, but with tails, the chains are too tight to slip, and the key is lost. We've got 5 days before the quirk wears off and we either drown or implode from the pressure. We're at a disadvantage movement-wise since we're both new to the whole tail thing. And we are going to start getting hungry and weaker pretty fast out here. Katsuki paced the anchor. Could it even be called pacing? He swam 1 revolution clockwise, then had to unwind the chain by going counterclockwise, both times around Izuku. Izuku almost wanted to join in, but he resisted so they wouldn't tangle their chains. Alright, well, Survival 101 would say we need shelter first, then heat, then water, then food. Katsuki finally stopped pacing to look at Izuku. None of which we can do right now. Right, so, our first concern is getting free. Yeah, and we've circled back around to where we were when we got tossed down here. If we aren't getting our strength back, we need that stupid key. Yeah, fuck. Katsuki glanced around at the sand beneath them, a bit disheartened. Izuku finally took a moment to check their larger surroundings. The sun was high in the sky above them at this point, and while it wasn't the usual visibility one might have at the surface, his eyes had adjusted to the darkness in the depths. If Izuku squinted, he could see a large reef about 50 yards to the northwest. That should be the direction of the coast. To the east was just an empty ocean, with some large stony drop-offs. The anchor they were chained to was wedged down into a short crevice on the ocean floor. They were about 20 feet from a rocky drop-off, though Izuku could see the bottom if he strained his eyes a little, so it wasn't too deep. Every so often they'd see schools of fish passing by, and maybe they'd miss some bigger critters in their frustration to escape. The reef he'd seen looked pretty full and populated, though, so maybe if they could get free, they could find some quick food. But if they were free of the anchor, why wouldn't they just go right to the shore? Izuku found it weird. His first thought was to get to the reef, not back to land. Wait, Katsuki had gone back to sifting hand with his hands. But he looked up when Izuku spoke. We can't go back. The fuck are you talking about? Of course we're going back. We're not dying out here, dumbass. No, Kaken, listen to me. What happened when Sea Snake kissed us? You started suffocating on dry land. Izuku nodded. We can't go back up there until this quirk wears off. But if we're down here when it does, we'll drown. Yeah, Izuku sighed. Fuck. Katsuki settled down onto the sand with his tail curled under him. Izuku joined him. Well, at first, he just settled close by, unsure if Katsuki really wanted his company right after realizing they had a very small window of opportunity to resolve their future drowning issues. They were both defeated, and more than a little frustrated. Izuku wouldn't blame the blonde if he wanted to be alone for a while. But apparently that wasn't the case. Izuku nearly jumped out of his scales when Katsuki's tail twisted around him and pulled him close with a big tug. The blonde wrapped his arms round Izuku's shoulders from behind and tucked his chin against the smaller teen's neck. Katsuki nuzzled against him and Izuku just sort of froze up. The sudden affection was unexpected and confusing. Kaken, what are you doing? The sudden nuzzling stopped. Katsuki's muscles tensed. A second later, he pulled himself back. I wasn't you just smelled really good. I what? Izuku stumbled back on the sand. Both tails were still tangled, and Katsuki refused to let go of Izuku. Their fins were practically knotted at this point. He tugged inquisitively, but that only made thick red scales brace harder against him. Kaken, my tail. What about it? Can you let go? Izuku leaned back a little. Katsuki leaned forward. What if I don't want to? Izuku blinked. The blonde was close enough that Izuku could see the orange-black fronds peeking out behind his ears. They flowed with the water around him, but every so often they'd perk up if Katsuki took a deep breath. Breathing was, perhaps, the weirdest part of their new bodies. Izuku could see Katsuki breathing. His chest rose and fell like it would on any other day. But there was no breath, air, or brush of water across Izuku's skin. Bubbles plumed around their necks, leaving the space between their faces almost thinner than it should be without their breaths mixing in front of them. Suddenly, Izuku caught the scent he assumed Katsuki had been speaking of. It wasn't a scent, really, it was more of a taste. That realization rattled his brain. Their senses were all mixed up and backwards. Taste was suddenly smell, and it overwhelmed Izuku's brain. It was both floral and sweet, with just a hint of that familiar burnt caramel. Izuku's mind went fuzzy and numb while their faces played a game of tides. The ocean would pull Izuku's face to the left and Katsuki's to the right. They'd almost meet, their lips mere inches apart each time they shifted past each other. Their tails coiled tighter and tighter until Izuku was sitting right in Katsuki's lap. In this soft moment, the sand didn't shift beneath them and Izuku could almost ignore the rattle of the chains still tightly binding his waist. Katsuki finally broke the meditative atmosphere by reaching up and cupping Izuku's face. His eyes closed and he couldn't resist the urge to lean into the hand. Fingers slowly traced their way up over his ear to tickle the edges. As Katsuki's fingers trailed up and up, they grazed over Izuku's fronds. Izuku's body reacted savagely. He jerked forward, leaning desperately into the hand brushing across the silvery fronds in his hair. Katsuki actually chirped, in whatever language they were speaking. Izuku responded with a satisfied trill. A rush of bubbles, water, and fish burst past them. Both men jumped at the sudden intrusion of their private moment. Their hearts were racing and they were both sported bright pink blush straight across their noses. Izuku covered his mouth with his hand and tried to uncurl his tail. This time, Katsuki let him. Still chained to the anchor, they floated apart a few feet to get their bearings. After a moment, it was Katsuki who broke the silence. Well, I guess we won't starve. He held up a rather big mackerel with a lopsided grin. Izuku couldn't help but to burst out laughing so hard he covered his neck from the rush of bubbles that tickled up across his ears. No, they wouldn't starve, but that was never really a huge worry, was it? After all, one could go weeks without food so long as they remained hydrated. And Izuku was pretty sure this was as hydrated as anyone could possibly get. The real worry was being crushed under the weight of the ocean or drowning at the bottom when they couldn't breathe underwater anymore. Katsuki crunched into the side of the mackerel. Blood and scales plumed around them. Izuku waved it away, but it still got stuck in his gills. He never thought he'd dislike the taste of blood so much. After 3 years fighting, a whole year at war, and daily training, the hero students of UA High were incredibly accustomed to the taste of blood, but getting it in his lungs made it taste horrible. Yeah, Izuku mused. I guess we won't. Ugh, blood in the gills is not a good taste. Katsuki coughed. No, it's not. But at least this is fresh. He offered the fish, which Izuku was more than happy to take and munch on while they spoke. Weird, I know sushi is good, but this isn't sushi. It's just raw, unprepared fish. So why does it taste amazing? Probably the quirk. Izuku muttered around the fish in his mouth. Katsuki shoved his shoulder. Swallow before you speak, idiot. Izuku handed back the fish after he took his share. The sun was beginning to set high above them. The water was darkening. All around them, the water stilled. Izuku and Katsuki both felt a chill sweep down the spines. Their muscles stiffened and Katsuki was already up and on the offensive with fists raised. Izuku was quick to guard his back as they floated in a slow circle around the anchor beneath them. The chains rattled faintly, reminding them they were trapped in the largest cage on Earth, alone. Something made his gills stand up, raised and flaring despite his breath being nervously shallow. They might be alone in the ocean, but they weren't by themselves anymore. There was something lurking out there, just out of sight, stalking them. Izuku instinctively barrel-rolled sideways as something big and dark darted past. What the fuck was that? He croaked. Fuck, the fish. What? Izuku, we just chummed the damn water we're trapped in. Izuku's eyes went wide. Katsuki had to duck next and Izuku got a glimpse of what was stalking them, a shark. An enormous shark. He couldn't get anything more than the basic shape from how fast it was and the darkness prevented any semblance of color clarity. Granted, the type of shark would only make a difference if they weren't swimming in the leftovers of their lunch. Sure, some sharks are relatively harmless until they're hungry. Get down, Katsuki hissed while grabbing his arm. They sunk themselves down right against the anchor, curled up into as small of a ball as they could muster. They couldn't run, and the anchor was their only defense. Izuku would have preferred a metal cage, but steel was steel after all. The giant beast whizzed past, just above their heads. Izuku felt his curls plume in the water from the force of the shark passing by. He clung to the anchor. It took him a moment to realize Katsuki wasn't beside him. He was wrapped around Izuku protectively. His tail was even coiled around the anchor atop Izuku's, holding him tightly to the metal. The metal pressed against Izuku's chest. His tail vibrated and sang from the shift and push of the tide against the anchor. Something about that made his bones shake in a disgusting way. He wished sharks could growl or hiss or something to startle their prey, but instead, they were silent. He vaguely remembered that stupid tidbit of information from a picture book when he was a child. Sharks didn't have an organ that produced sound. They were silent hunters. They could sneak up on their prey without even trying. The tide shifted again. The shark made another pass. This time, he felt the eruption of bubbles when the beast chomped its jaws down right above them. Izuku felt the tug on his hair, the pain of a small chunk getting ripped out after getting caught, likely on the shark's teeth. He tried to bite back the whimper that practically erupted from his throat, but he couldn't. Katsuki managed to slap a hand over his mouth before more than a peep came out. They remained still for hours, until the eerie echo of life in the water vanished, that sensation of being observed, hunted. Once that sensation was finally gone, Katsuki's shoulders relaxed just enough that Izuku felt like he could breathe a little easier. By the time the shark realized it ate the source of the bloodied waters, it was morning. The sun had risen far above them. Katsuki had yet to release him, but their coil had turned into a cuddle instead of a fearful cower. The blonde was still cupping the back of his head, cradling it to his chest. Izuku rested his chin on Katsuki's shoulder for a while, choosing not to be fully awake yet not sleeping either. The comfort of the arms around him almost made him forget they were buried alive in the ocean. He almost forgot, until the glint of sunlight made him squint his eyes. The glint of sunlight. There couldn't be anything down here to reflect sunlight. Except, Kaken. His sudden outburst startled the blonde, who nearly fell backwards had his tail not been coiled around Izuku's in the anchor. Izuku quickly uncurled his tail and flicked it, shoving himself as far as his chain would allow. What the hell are you doing? The damn shark could still be here. Kaken, the key. What? The key. But no matter how hard Izuku pumped his tail and pulled himself forward, he couldn't quite reach the blasted thing. It was just out of reach, just outside the reach of their damn chain. No, he cried, fingers clawing at the sand to drag him closer. Izuku, stop, you'll stir up the sand. It's there, Kaken. It's right there. I know. The blonde pulled his shoulders up, hugged Izuku to his chest. Izuku refused to calm down, though. He flicked his tail, slammed his fists against Katsuki's chest, and screamed into the void of the ocean around them. Katsuki held him firm, but Izuku could feel the way his muscles tensed and his jaw set against Izuku's temple. He was angry, just like Izuku, frustrated and scared. They were alone in the ocean, trapped. Izuku couldn't remember why they'd swam away from the reef in the first place. There wasn't a reason to, was there? That shark could have killed them and no one cared. They'd done it on purpose. Humans had left them chained to an anchor for the fun of it, the thrill of leaving beautiful creatures helpless in their own territory. So why did this feel so out of place? Izuku rubbed the eye off his head, trying to remember how he knew all of that. Izuku, can you remember what happened? Oh, it wasn't just Izuku, then. We were we were on the reef, right? He pointed to the west. Just there. We live there, don't we? But someone took us. Someone brought us here, chained us to this anchor and left us to die. He scrunched his eyebrows, confused. The shark. There was a shark. That's the last clear memory I have. Me too. But we need the key. How are we supposed to get the key? Katsuki sighed. I don't know, love. Love. Izuku tilted his head. Why did Katsuki call him that? He could remember, couldn't he? He knew why, but he couldn't remember why. Yes, love. You're my mate. Izuku blinked. I forget that. How could I forget that? I forgot too, until just now. What's happening to us? I don't know. He reached out and clutched Katsuki's face. His mate's face. How could he have forgotten his own mate? How could he have forgotten his whole life on the reef, his mother, his friends, everything? Izuku rubbed his eyes, as if he'd been sleeping for a long time, but he finally felt awake for the first time in years. It's all right. Katsuki kissed his forehead. The gesture was familiar, something he'd done for years to remind Izuku he was loved and never alone. Come on, we need that damn key. Right. Izuku brushed a hand up through Katsuki's spikes, across his orange and black fronds. The blonde melted in his hand, smiling as he leaned over to kiss Izuku's hand. We can do this, Kaken. His mate nodded. Together, they stared down the glinting silver key just a few feet outside their reach. The trouble was, how would they get to it? With only 4 feet each, and not adjustable, there were few things they could go to reach the damn thing. Since they weren't on a single chain, they couldn't just extend it by having one of them stay closer to the anchor. So the key was 8 feet away, roughly, and they only had 4 to work with, plus the extra foot their arms gave them. So how did they gain an extra 2 feet without any additional chain? Watch out, Katsuki grunted. Izuku pushed off the sand gently, moving his fluke out of the way for the blonde to make an attempt at the key. He grabbed a length of seaweed from nearby and a flattish rock. Izuku titled his head a little, looming over Katsuki's shoulders to watch what he was doing. The explosive blonde tied the seaweed around the rock, forming a makeshift tool that could actually work. That's so smart, Kaken. Of course it is, it's my idea. Izuku giggled and floated out of the way as his mate spun the rock and tossed it outside their reach, still attached to the seaweed. It missed, landing wide to the right of the key, glinting obnoxiously in their faces. It took another 4 tries for Katsuki to get the rock right on top of the key, and another several slow tugs to pull the key through the sand into their reach. The second it was within their 4-foot range, Izuku dove and snatched the key up before a strong tide could carry it away. He clutched it to his chest while Katsuki deflated as the stress left his body, which sank him right to the sand while he took a moment to breathe. I got it. Izuku sighed contentedly. I've got it. We can go home. Home, Katsuki repeated in a dreamy voice. I feel like we haven't seen the reef in years. I don't remember. I thought we were on our way home when we got captured. Maybe you're right. What's wrong? Izuku didn't like his tone of voice. I don't know, Zu. Just feels like I'm forgetting something important, like we've fallen down the rabbit hole and I'm waiting for Alice to pop out of the corner and welcome me to Wonderland. Izuku settled on the sand next to Katsuki and brushed a soft hand through his hair, careful to avoid his fronds for the time being. That's just a fairy tale they tell hatchlings at bedtime. Kaken, we're going to make it home to the reef, and then you'll feel better. You're right. I'm being dumb. Enough of that. Katsuki flicked his tail, stirring up the sand which Izuku had to wave away from his gills with a cough as he floated up as well. He offered the key out to Katsuki. The blonde sported a wicked grin as he grabbed it and quickly unlatched Izuku from the chains that had kept him trapped for days. The second Katsuki released his own right after, Izuku bolted upwards to the light. They might be designed to survive under the great pressure of the ocean, but Izuku still loved the sun at the surface. He always had. Katsuki was hot on his tail. The splash of water filled their ears as they surfaced, both holding their breath so they wouldn't choke in the air. Izuku let his head fall backwards, the sun high in the sky and warm on his face. It felt like an eternity since he felt that warmth on his scales. Even if he couldn't breathe the air, he felt like something had shifted, something inside of him had changed, and he was happy. Katsuki wrapped his arms around Izuku. His chin weighed down Izuku's shoulder and they both sank low enough for their gills to be underwater, breathing while their cheeks warmed in the sun above them. Katsuki nuzzled his ear. Their fronds brushed together, shooting little tingles down Izuku's spine and making his fins shiver. I remembered what I forgot, Katsuki whispered in his ear. Izuku shivered a second time. What's that? He asked, tilting his head just enough that he could see those molten red irises staring him down. They were alight like lava pools under the afternoon sun. Izuku wanted to get lost in them forever, no matter how much he melted in their heat. You are my home, Izuku practically purred, a rumble from deep in his throat that echoed out through his gills and warbled in the water. Katsuki growled back while nipping at Izuku's ear. He laughed, the sound like a bird chirping, whipped away by the sea breeze around them. Izuku woke up to the comfort of strong arms wrapped around him and a warm blanket of moss and seaweed coating both him and his mate. The cave they called home was simple. And though they were a little confused as to its emptiness when they arrived, the thought was quickly dismissed. Katsuki had easily set up a nest for them and even gathered some clams along the reef for dinner before they went to bed. They enjoyed the sunset together while munching on clams. When Izuku admitted he couldn't go back to sleep, he coiled his tail around Katsuki's a little tighter and kissed along his gills. They flared under his lips. Katsuki was awake, and likely had been for a while. Good morning, you little brat. Izuku giggled. Morning, Kaken. Katsuki buried his face in Izuku's hair, kissing along the soft edges of his fronds. Izuku shivered and dug his nails into Katsuki's back, pulling them closer together. The blonde wrapped his arms tight, hands flat against Izuku's back and caressing his spine. What would you like to do today, my beautiful mate? Izuku sighed heavily as he debated all they could spend their day doing. Izuku wanted to reacquaint himself with the reef. They'd been away for so long it felt like a whole new place. It almost felt like he'd never been here before, which was a silly thought. They could fish, or maybe scavenge for stuff to add to their little cave buried in the coral reef. However, something deep in Izuku's soul wanted to wander and roam. Finally, he stretched his arms up above his head and yawned. I kind of want to wander. We just got home, Zoo. I know, we could get caught again. That's always a risk. Come on, don't you want to see what's out there? We spent years adrift in the ocean, but we're finally home to our reef and we could see what's closer to shore. Katsuki growled. What's closer to shore is just dangerous. You know that. If we go to shore, we'll get caught again. And it won't be an anchor in the middle of the ocean this time. It will be the butcher for us, giant sushi. Kachin, Izuku whined. The burly red Marrow rolled his eyes and groaned dramatically. Fine, but if we get our asses caught again, it's your fucking fault. I can live with that. Come on. Izuku tried to drag his mate up from the moss and seaweed-covered cave floor, but Katsuki had a very different idea of what he wanted to do when they woke up. The blonde played limp fish, which left Izuku to pull on his arm and get basically nowhere. Kaolacho and Izuku cried. He could see the grin Katsuki was trying to hide. He was doing this on purpose. Izuku suddenly yelped when he was yanked back down to the ground and rolled over, their flukes coiling and their fins tangled. Kachin, his vision was filled with only his mate, burning red eyes melting into his retinas. He couldn't escape, nor did he have any desire to do so. Katsuki tightened his grip on Izuku's tail, making the smaller Marrow arch his back in surprise. Izuku's eyes fluttered closed as Katsuki's lips came down to his neck and pressed along his gills, leaving trailing kisses across the flaring skin which made breathing nearly impossible. Izuku puffed bubbles from his lips, trying to focus on his goals, up and out, adventuring. But distraction was too easy when Katsuki was all he could see and taste around him. We'll leave soon, Katsuki whispered into his ear. But first, I want you. I want my mate. I cannot remember the last time I heard you call my name in ecstasy. Truth be told, neither could Izuku. He couldn't remember the last time Katsuki touched him like this, or the last time his body was wholly enveloped by his mate. That seemed impossible. They spent almost every moment with each other, did they not? How could he forget this feeling? Izuku's breath hitched in his gills when Katsuki's fingers found the fronds in his hair and rubbed them between his thumb and forefinger. The pinch sent little trailing tingles down the back of his skull and spine. The water around them plumed with the rich scent of caramel and the heavy scent of pine needles. They were both aroused, and their pheromones were beginning to mix and ward off other creatures in the ocean, a threat that they were about to mate and would claw anything near them to death if necessary when interrupted. Izuku grabbed Katsuki's sides, just over his ribs, and squeezed. Katsuki choked a little and he felt the blonde's fluke strangling him. They might not have gills along their ribs, but there were little fins, almost imperceptible, right along that area. They were for sensing currents and changing direction. Izuku trailed his fingers along them a few times, enough to make his mate shiver. Katsuki was quick to return the favor, but instead of using his hands, he quickly sunk lower and dragged the flat of his tongue right across Izuku's tide fin. The smaller mer gasped, his whole body jerking off the mossy ground and pushing them into the empty space above their bed. Katsuki growled his excitement and pulled himself up again. He grabbed the back of Izuku's head and crushed their lips together in a heated kiss. Izuku flipped them over with a flick of what small part of his tail he had control over. Katsuki's back settled on their bed as he deepened their kiss and explored Izuku's mouth as if it were the shell of a clam he wanted to devour every scrap of. Izuku groaned into the kiss, all too happy to oblige and be devoured. When the kiss finally broke, they were both gasping water through their gills and the water around them was full of stirred-up bubbles and ripples. Izuku shook his head to try and clear it, but that was useless. Katsuki flipped them again, but this time he shoved Izuku against the cave wall hard enough to shake the rocks around them. Izuku grunted, but any pain he felt was quickly melted away when his mate began touching him. "You're beautiful," Katsuki trilled in the back of his throat. "You're mine." Izuku couldn't form a coherent reply, so he nodded. Katsuki's fingers were trailing down his front and sides, caressing the tide fins on his ribs, then lower until they reached the point where skin met scale. Izuku wriggled a little, ushering Katsuki's hand lower, begging to be touched as their tails coiled somehow tighter. "So impatient, my little mate." Izuku's head slammed into the cave wall behind him when Katsuki's fingers finally reached that sweet spot, a large scale covering the center front of his tail, the entrance to his cloaca. Katsuki's finger caressed the bottom edge, patiently asking for entry lest he harm himself and Izuku alike. "NGH cacaw." Izuku cried, his muscles tensing for a moment then all relaxing as the mating process finally started. His tail loosened as Katsuki's tightened, holding him in place against the wall as he prepared the smaller marrow. Please," he begged. Katsuki kissed the edge of his lips, then his cheek, his ear, and whispered, "So impatient." He teased again, just as his fingers slipped under that large scale and entered Izuku. Izuku's clawed fingers gripped the wall in some vain attempt to still his hips. But nature took over and his body was moving to the soft, slow rhythm of Katsuki's fingers caressing the inner edges of his sex. Swallowing back the sensation of drunkenness, Izuku cracked his eyes open to watch his mate. The blonde was staring him down with hungry eyes. Katsuki was a starving man and Izuku was the only food offered for miles. What a feast he would have. Izuku could see the bulge of his own frontal scale. But Katsuki liked to tease, to play. He would hold himself back for hours all to watch Izuku writhe in agony and bliss. Today, Izuku wasn't in the mood for a long session. He wanted his mate, and he would have him. He reached a hand between them, copying Katsuki's actions a moment ago and tracing the edge of that singular scale. Katsuki's head fell against the rock just beside Izuku's face with a long groan. "I want you," Izuku insisted. "Now, if, fuck." Katsuki grunted out, his body jerking forward into Izuku's probing fingers, pressing them inside without warning. Izuku gasped, feeling his mate's hemipene catching immediately around his fingertips. Katsuki grabbed his face, forcing him into another passionate kiss as they both masturbated each other for a few heated moments. Izuku rubbed his thumb along the twiting and coiled hemipene in his hand, teasing just enough to coax it out, longer and longer. Katsuki continued to lower his defenses, working his entrance open wide so it wouldn't snap shut protectively when Katsuki moved to take him. Even if they both wanted each other desperately, they couldn't ignore the natural defenses of their bodies. There was also something incredibly intimate and connecting about very physically opening each other up as if they were locked boxes or guarded city walls that needed keys to each door. Izuku wanted Katsuki to be the key to every lock on his heart. Katsuki chirped, his tongue cutting off the word as he once again rolled them to the side. This time, Katsuki was against the wall with his tail tucked to the side and wrapped counterclockwise around Izuku's. Izuku twisted his own opposite so their bodies could meet in the middle. Their hands slid back up to each other's faces. Their foreheads met and Katsuki carefully hooked their scales together as his tail twisted at the end, locking them together. Izuku took a few choked breaths as he nodded. "Please," he begged again. "I'm ready. I love you." Katsuki brushed a hand across the silvery green fronds in his hair again, sending one last wave of pleasure down his body right as the blonde's elongated hemipene slipped between their scales and sought Izuku's usually hidden entrance. Izuku's head fell back with a moaning cry of pleasure that gripped his whole body. Their bodies floated up and began to spin in place. The rotation of their flukes and fins caused a cyclone of water to form around them, sealing them off from the surrounding ecosystem. They were in a world all their own. Katsuki grabbed the back of his head and pressed Izuku's face into the crook of his shoulder. Izuku was more than happy to kiss and lick along Katsuki's gills, his most sensitive part. Years of familiarity and love had formed between them. They knew each other's most sacred of places, most holy of touches that could send them to heaven and back. Katsuki was brushing his tongue along the joint where his frond met the space behind his ear. Oh, if Izuku were ice he would be melting in his lover's arms for eternity. Katsuki's lengthened hemipene slowly found its way into Izuku's deepest parts, coiling round and round until he didn't think he could fit any more within himself. His eyes rolled back in his head. Finally, his body was able to coil itself back around Katsuki's tail, which flipped the direction of their slow spin. Katsuki kissed down along his neck. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice raspy and breathless. "Are you sure?" They didn't usually get this far. They'd agreed not to. They hadn't decided if they wanted hatchlings yet. But Izuku was too far gone right now. He was silently begging for release, for that filling sensation in his belly to never stop. He managed to slip one hand between them and roam a hand across his stomach then down lower so he could split his fingers and massage their locked scales. Katsuki rutted against him, nearly unbalancing their mating dance. "Yes," he finally moaned out. Katsuki kissed him again, passionately. Izuku returned his hands to his mate's face, holding him in place while their tongues fought for dominance in his mouth. But he lost the moment Katsuki released his sperm within Izuku. A flood of warmth filled his egg sac. Izuku's vision blanked white, nearly blacking out. His gills flared and Katsuki had to wrap both hands around his back to keep him upright. He could feel his stomach filling, expanding from Katsuki emptying himself within Izuku. When Katsuki released the kiss, Izuku's head fell back and he trilled his mate's name deep in the back of his throat. It was a guttural sort of animalistic cry of pleasure, as if to signify the end of their coupling. Katsuki was quick to retreat himself just as Izuku's cloaca snapped shut, sealing himself once more. Izuku's body went limp in his mate's arms. Katsuki lowered them both to the mossy cave floor, still coiled around Izuku but loosely now. He brushed Izuku's hair from his face and peppered his face with little kisses that were both sweet and intimate at the same time. "My beautiful mate, look at you," breathless and blushing, Katsuki whispered. Izuku smiled. He found enough energy to seek out one last kiss. "I love you, Kakon." I love you too." A few moments later, sleep claimed him and they were once again passed out in each other's arms, buried in seaweed and safely hidden away from the world in their cave. Izuku stretched his arms above his head with a big yawn. Katsuki was already awake, floating nearby with a knife and some clams. His tongue was sticking out between his lips cutely as he cracked open the little mollusks so they could eat breakfast. The blonde smiled when he noticed Izuku waking up and tossed him a couple open clams so Izuku could eat. "Morning, beautiful." Katsuki settled down next to him and kissed his forehead. His free hand rubbed over Izuku's growing belly, already swollen with their hatchlings. How had it been 2 months already? Izuku was losing track of time, and he wasn't sure if he should be worried about that. "Morning, love." Izuku leaned up to kiss his mate's cheek. He settled back down and dug into his breakfast. Again, that urge to search out the shore panged in his chest. Maybe today, he told himself. But didn't he tell himself that every day? He couldn't remember. They'd filled their little cave with trinkets and trophies over the last several months since arriving home. Izuku had even begun making a nest for their hatchlings in the corner. Katsuki had carved out a few shelves from the rocky inner walls of their cave to make storage space for their tools and even a couple handmade trinkets. Katsuki had made a couple knives from sharpened rocks and carved some toys and even a couple combs for their hair. "I should go hunting today. You've been getting hungrier with the little ones growing inside you." I have. But I was hoping to venture closer to shore today, with you." "The shore is dangerous, Izuku." "You always say that, but you never tell me why, Kaken. Was our entrapment on that anchor not enough? Should I take you back there to remind you?" "No." Izuku had a distinct revulsion at the idea of going back to the anchor. Of course it was still there. It would likely be there long after their lives had come and gone. But he had no desire to see it. He was scared to see it for some unknown reason he couldn't explain. "Then why do you keep insisting on venturing closer to shore? We'll be taken hostage again, or we'll be killed. You're carrying our hatchlings. Don't you want to protect them?" "Of course I do, Kaken." Izuku was horrified that his mate would suggest he didn't want to protect their young. He pushed himself off the seafloor and swam out of their cave, but Katsuki followed and grabbed his arm to stop him. Izuku stopped swimming, but he didn't look back yet. "Please, Izuku, my beautiful beloved mate, please don't suggest the shore again." Izuku sighed. "Okay, Kaken." Katsuki hugged him carefully and rubbed one hand across his belly. Izuku sunk into the soft feeling of his lover's arms and heartbeat against his ear. A few weeks later, the pain startled Izuku out of a fitful sleep. It wasn't the hatchlings. No, it was something in his chest. Something ached, like he couldn't breathe. Izuku rolled over and found Katsuki struggling to get water down his gills just like Izuku was. They reached for each other, gasping and crying soft tears that floated around them, denser than the ocean's salty water. "Izuku," Katsuki croaked out. "I can't." But a moment later, it was gone. Izuku was sitting up in bed with Katsuki wrapped around him protectively as they watched the sun setting across the ocean outside their cave. Izuku blinked. When? Something wasn't right. Time was moving too fast. He could feel it now. Despite that, his hands still sought his growing belly, round and full of young. Finding them safe within him settled his mind, and he put the worries to the back of his thoughts and enjoyed the sunset with his partner. Katsuki slowly brushed his fingers through Izuku's hair and fronds, teasing him just a little. They hadn't been too active in the last month or two while Izuku was pregnant, but they still liked to tease each other for fun, just a little. It was nice to enjoy the tingles that ran down his spine while they relaxed on a warm evening together. "How many do you think there are?" Katsuki asked. Izuku shrugged. "I can feel maybe 2. It's hard to tell when they aren't yet old enough to swim around in there, or push their eggs against my belly to count them." Well, maybe there will be just one big warrior like me." Izuku chuckled and leaned up to kiss Katsuki's cheek. "Oh, but maybe they will all be little adventurers like me. Maybe they will find their way to the deepest oceans and the bright sunny shallows. Maybe they will go where we never could." "Maybe," Katsuki agreed. They rested there, in silence, until the sun went down and they fell asleep curled around each other like every night. "Kaylee, Naya, dinner time." Izuku called for their 2 girls, who came bursting through the cave entrance at his call. The girls were almost 4, and they were finally old enough to check out the reef on their own, just a little. Izuku still kept a careful eye on them when they were out, but Katsuki was usually around, too, when he wasn't hunting. The reef was safe, so they should be fine on their own, but Izuku was a worrying parent, especially after that lionfish encounter not long ago. "Duh," Kaylee tackled him. Izuku chuckled. She had bright red scales and beautifully long blonde hair. She looked like a copy of Katsuki. She was bold, brash, and just as explosive as her father, but she had a little more of Izuku's obedient streak when needed. "What's for dinner?" Naya asked, swimming up alongside them. The smaller of the twins had Izuku's curls, but her hair was a faded green, almost pastel. Her scales were a mix of green and red, reminding Izuku of Christmas. Her fronds were stark white, too, and nearly invisible in her hair, as if transparent sometimes. She put a hand on Izuku's once more growing belly to greet her coming sibling. Izuku cupped her hand and smiled. "Your father is preparing some barracuda for dinner. Both of you should give him a good smack on the arm. He nearly got himself speared by a swordfish on his hunt." "The idiot." "I heard that," Katsuki called from inside the cave. They'd recently dug the cave a bit deeper, so they had several more rooms to expand into. The girls had their own room. Izuku and Katsuki had one, and they'd just finished carving out a room for the new hatchlings. The girls swam off at their own top speeds to greet their father, and Izuku spent a few minutes watching the reef. Again, that registration of time moving came to mind. Too fast, his mind was telling him. Faster and faster. Something didn't make sense about how fast his life was moving. But when he thought back, he could remember every day. Or at least he could remember details from the important ones. So why should he be concerned with the speed of life? Didn't his mother once tell him that the older you got, the faster time moved? Yeah, she did. So maybe that's all it was. "Izuku," Katsuki called. "Coming." After one last look out to the reef, Izuku flicked his tail and went back down into their main living space where his family was waiting. He spent a wonderful evening with his mate and two girls. They devoured the whole barracuda that Katsuki had caught for them, and played a game with fish bones and rocks. His mother once called it jacks, or he was pretty sure she had, at least. Once their hatchlings were asleep, Izuku and Katsuki curled up at the entrance of the cave to guard until the sun went down completely. Sometimes the darkness worried them, but only when the sun was setting. There was something about the sunset that always made Izuku wonder if he'd forgotten something important, but Katsuki always assured him that he hadn't. He was safe, and they never needed to leave their beloved home. They were happy with their little family, and the reef was the perfect home. Izuku fell asleep in his mate's arms, safe and loved. When Izuku next remembered waking, there was something inside his mind calling to him. A voice, half familiar and yet long forgotten, but still calling out from the depths of his memory as if there was something incredibly important that he forgot. Izuku shook his head, trying to erase that weird thought. But the memory wouldn't stop screaming ... And oh, that was a voice, not a memory. "Izuku," the woman shouted. Izuku startled so roughly he flipped himself out of his cozy bed, which startled Katsuki awake as well. But before he could even regain his composure, his mind was thrust sideways, yanked into some other place, somewhere deep in his mind. He landed, stumbled, and collapsed to his hands and knees. Why did he have knees? Why did he have legs? Izuku screamed. Where was his tail? "Izuku," the woman's voice called again. "Izuku, look at me." He looked up, right into Nana's eyes. Recognition slapped him in the face along with every memory he'd forgotten. His whole life flashed before his eyes. He screamed again as his mind filled with everything that had happened, and not just the last few days, but his whole 18 years of life. It was too much at once. He collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. Nana held him through all of it, until finally he could breathe again after what felt like hours. "This isn't real," Izuku mumbled to himself, wincing at the pain it caused his already aching head. Nana shook her head. "It's not real. You're under the effects of a very powerful quirk. It took everything we had just to reach you and pull you into the vestige world. This quirk is deadly. If you and Katsuki do not reach the shore in the next 12 hours, you'll drown. But ... but I don't want to go back. I'm happy here, with Kakin, and ... His hands wrapped around his stomach, clutching what he believed was the life growing there. But his stomach was gone, flattened. Izuku was his true self in the vestige world, and it horrified him. "I'm sorry, Izuku, it's not real. You need to wake up. Please, you need to wake up or you'll die. Your time is running out. Please, you must accept this as a dream." "How is it a dream? You're still chained to that anchor where you've been this whole time." "But when the pain started, when you think you shifted into merman, you both passed out and haven't woken up since." "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I'm so very, terribly sorry. But if you don't wake up, you will both drown." Izuku didn't want to accept that. He didn't want to believe any of the last several years was a dream. He'd been with his mate. He'd been happy. He'd been home. How could any of that be a dream? How could he accept that Katsuki being his mate wasn't real? That finding their home wasn't real? That their two beautiful daughters weren't real? That the growing life inside of him wasn't real? None of it was real. None of it was real, and Izuku wanted to crumple into nothingness. He wanted to sob until he'd become nothing but a tiny rock on the ocean floor where he could die. His life was a lie. And he didn't want to live in this cruel reality where he was forced to accept his life on land, with villains and battle wounds and more PTSD than he knew what to do with. He didn't want any of that. He'd been happy in the ocean. "Izuku, please," Nana insisted. "Wake up, now." She kissed his forehead. Izuku was sobbing uncontrollably in her arms. But she was right. He'd die if he didn't wake up. He would die if he didn't get them free. He knew where the key was. He knew how to get it. He just had to wake up. He had to save them both. The vestige world snapped closed, tossing Izuku headlong back into his own mind. But he didn't go back to sleep. This time, he gasped awake in the ocean, still linked to an anchor by a chain around his waist. He could breathe underwater, but his legs were still legs. He was still human, and Katsuki was floating next to him, almost lifeless, comatose. Izuku didn't bother with Katsuki just yet. He needed to focus on getting them free and getting them to the damn surface. He could feel himself hiccuping sobs the whole time, but he did his best to ignore the grief burrowing itself into his chest. He could cry over his losses later. Right now, he needed to avoid drowning 80 miles offshore. Dear God, how would they swim 80 miles back? Even if they made it to the surface before the quirk ran out, how were they going to swim 80 miles after hanging lifeless in the ocean for a week? Izuku shook his head. He had to focus. Izuku. Katsuki's voice was frail. Izuku stopped. Boy, where are you? Oh God. Izuku hadn't even considered that their dream was shared. If Izuku was awake, would Katsuki suffer alone in that dream without him? Was Katsuki searching the ocean for him, confused and frightened that his mate was gone? Izuku kicked his feet faster. He had to get them free. He couldn't have a teary reunion yet, or he would waste time. He grabbed the rock Katsuki had taken in their dream, and wrapped it with a quickly braided rope of seaweed. The silver key was glinting nearby, and indeed, just out of reach. Izuku exhaled slowly. He tried to make his whole body stop shaking, but it refused. He could still hear Katsuki calling him from a few feet away. The blonde was practically crying in anguish, but Izuku ignored it. He had to save them. He had to. He threw the rock. It missed. Izuku shook out his arms and tried again. His whole body was sluggish with disuse and weak from soaking in water for a week on end. Again, it missed. The third time he landed right on the key and slowly reeled the rock in. But just like in the dream, it wasn't that simple. He had to throw the rock several more times before he managed to reel the key into reach and snatch it off the sandy ocean floor. Oh fuck, he gasped, shivering from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I got it. Bubbles rushed around him as he heaved water through his gills. That was the only part of this whole experience that had been real. Izuku was so angry and sad, but now was not the time to process his emotions. He quickly swam back over and focused on getting them to the surface. Getting the damn key had taken 3 hours of achingly slow progress. They had 9 hours left. It was a lot and yet not enough at the same time. They just had to get to the surface before the quirk ran out. They had to get to the surface. Izuku. Katsuki wailed again, quiet and begging. Izuku's chest ached for his mate. No, Katsuki wasn't his mate. That hadn't been real. It wasn't real, right? Kaken, Izuku called, slapping his hand over the blonde's cheek with one hand while the other focused on their chains. Kaken, wake up. He screamed the words as he worked the key into the padlock. His fingers were shaking so bad he could barely grip the lock on his mate's stomach, on Katsuki's stomach. The ocean was cold, incredibly cold, and while they hadn't felt it early on, he could feel the quirk wearing off. They were slowly losing their ability to survive out here, and they needed to move now. Kicchan. Izuku slapped the blonde so hard it actually sounded in the heavy watery atmosphere around them. Katsuki thrashed in the water, his wake-up call just as violent as Izuku's having been thrust into the vestige world. Izuku, he gasped, grabbing for the smaller teen's face. I lost you, oh God, where are you? The blonde was grabbing for him, but Izuku pushed back, trying to keep them focused. I'm right here, but where did you ... what the fuck? He looked down, seeing their legs and the chains. The blonde was starting to panic. Where the fuck is my fluke? Where are my fins? Where's Kaylee? Naya? Where? Izuku was too damn cold. They were wasting time. He clutched the key in one hand and grabbed Katsuki's face. He pulled them into a passionate kiss, one he hoped would be returned. It was, thankfully it was. Izuku melted into it, and he knew in that instance, even if it had all been a dream, it was real enough while it lasted. It wasn't real. It wasn't fucking real, Kaken. The quirk makes you breathe underwater and dream of living life as a mer while slowly robbing you of your memory so you don't want to return to the surface, and you drown. We have 9 hours to get out of this mess. We're wasting time. Katsuki took all of 40 seconds to process that information. Izuku watched him roll through all the stages of grief in that short amount of time. But once he had, his face hardened as his eyes sunk to Izuku's stomach. Izuku looked away. The blonde pressed his fingertips to Izuku's flat abdomen and they were both on the verge of falling apart. He thought of Kaylee and Naya, and the unborn life growing within him, and it nearly made him want to drown right there, trapped on the ocean floor. But it wasn't real. Izuku snapped, pushing away the guilt and grief. Let me speak, please. Izuku nodded, offering a silent apology by taking Katsuki's free hand and squeezing it tightly to try and soothe his own fears. The time might have been a dream, but were the emotions real? Did I just imagine that you loved me? Was it all fake for you? Because it wasn't for me. It wasn't fake, Izuku. I love you. I'm trying to keep everything together right now because I want to rip the fucker apart who did this. They took away our FUD. He let out a shaky breath and wiped his hand over his mouth, releasing Izuku. No, Izuku pulled Katsuki back by his shoulder. The emotions weren't made up. I don't feel any different now than I did in the dream. Not about you, at least. I still love you. I think I always have. Katsuki turned back and wrapped him in a hug, crushing Izuku's face into his shoulder. He allowed them a few minutes to wallow in that grief, the loss of their lives, their happiness, and the children they could never have in this reality. Izuku clutched his own stomach and sobbed into his mate's chest as they sank to the ocean floor. Katsuki clutched him, crying silently alongside him. It hurt so much to finally accept the reality with Katsuki enveloping him with strong arms and those damn legs. Izuku wanted to cut them off himself. He wanted his tail back, his life back, his home and children. How could he go back to the surface like this? How could he face the whole of their class, their heroes, their teachers and parents, when his heart would be trapped down here for the rest of his life? Katsuki ran his hands through Izuku's hair and soothed him. Izuku wasn't sure how long they'd been sitting there on the ocean floor, letting their grief be carried away on the ocean tides. When Izuku finally felt like he could breathe, he pulled back and wiped his face. It wasn't necessary given they were underwater, but it was a habit. You good? Katsuki asked, voice shaky. Izuku shook his head. No, I don't think I will be for a while. Yeah, me either. It took them another half hour to get out of their chains. They were both shaking and exhausted, and breathing was quickly becoming difficult the longer they stayed down here. Once they were free, Izuku rubbed at his waist. The chains had cut into their stomachs and sides, likely from the tides moving them freely and bumping them around the ocean. Thankfully, there wasn't much blood. He really hoped that experience with the shark had been part of the dream and not something that actually happened while they were knocked out. He was fairly sure the marks on their waists would scar, but the both of them already had so many from the war. What was one more? Katsuki wrapped his arm around Izuku's waist and they worked together to kick to the surface. It took another long stretch of time to unbury themselves from the ocean floor. Izuku was too tired to count. He'd been trying to keep a careful record of the time in case they got trapped again. But now that they were on their way to the surface, he just didn't have the energy to care anymore. When they splashed through the surface, Izuku gulped down fresh air. Their lungs were already half adjusted as the quirk was almost gone. His legs were shaking, but he did his best to keep them kicking so they would stay floating. Katsuki was resting his head on Izuku's shoulder, kicking a little harder for them both. He must have slightly more energy than Izuku. Cover your ears. What? Izuku groaned. Cover your ears. He held up his left arm, palm to the sky. Gonna signal. Who? Kaken. Still, he covered his ears. Everyone. Anyone. That was probably about as good as they would get. If anyone was out on the ocean, they should hopefully see Katsuki's quirk if it worked. Izuku still didn't feel his own static buzzing in his bones. He could feel the vestiges quietly trying to worm their way back into his head, but his quirk was still too weak to use. Actually, he was weak overall. The explosions sounded, 3 in a row, and fired into the air like flares before exploding like fireworks. Izuku's head rattled in his skull. He was so fucking tired. How were they going to get themselves to shore like this? I got you, nerd. Katsuki rested his face into Izuku's soaked curls. My mate. Izuku whimpered. He tried to click and trill his voice, but the language of the ocean felt different, distant now. He nuzzled his chin on his mate's shoulder and purred in the back of his throat. I want to go home, Kaken. I know, love. I know. But it wasn't real. Izuku swallowed back the tears threatening to choke him again and nodded. But we can make it real. Katsuki grabbed his face. Look at me, please. Izuku looked up, trying to blink the tears out of his eyes. We can make it real. He kissed Izuku's forehead. If that's what you want. I do. Izuku buried his face under Katsuki's chin and hugged his arms around the blonde's chest. Katsuki kissed the top of his head. They stayed there, with Izuku's head on Katsuki's shoulder, until the quirk deactivated completely. They felt it. It ripped itself from their chests almost as horribly as when they thought they were being turned into mer. Izuku clung to his mate's body, and Katsuki clutched the back of his head tightly. It felt like hours of agony, but they didn't pass out this time. They also didn't drown. They weren't crushed at the bottom of the ocean. So they'd won, right? They won the bet those stupid villains forced them to take, but they'd lost years of their lives inside a dream in the process. Izuku didn't feel like they'd won anything. He was grieving the loss of events that never happened. Katsuki fired another round of explosions into the sky, but they were weaker than the first round. Izuku could feel his quirk starting to buzz into his bones again, but he didn't have any ability that would signal nearby boats. Well, he could do one thing. Izuku used his air force to push Katsuki's explosions higher so they were visible farther away before they burst into fireworks. Izuku closed his eyes and kissed Katsuki's bare shoulder. If we get out of this, do you want to go back to UA? Izuku asked, his voice soft and full of fear. I don't know, nerd. He rubbed a hand over his face to wipe the excess water from his hair and eyes. I'm not really sure how to. Process, right now. Yeah. A ship's horn blared in the distance, making them both jump. Katsuki clutched him tighter, protectively. But the moment they spotted the Coast Guard's logo on the ship in the distance, they both relaxed. Katsuki fired another round of explosions, but this time smaller so the ship could locate them more directly. The skiff was about the size of an average sailboat, but with a little more metal and less wood. It was likely engine-powered as well. The ship came alongside them and a familiar face popped over the railing. "Boys," Aizawa cried. "Oh, thank the gods, you're alive." He turned. "It's them. They're alive." Sukachi came to the railing next, relief clear on his face. Present Mike was next, along with Officer Sansa. Aizawa slumped over the railing, looking as exhausted as always but greatly relieved to see his students. The two teens shared a bit of an unsure look. "We have to go, don't we?" Izuku asked. Katsuki nodded sadly. Izuku wiped some wet curls from his face and tried to smile. "Stay by my side, Kaken. Always." Flotation rings and ropes were thrown down first, both of which they grabbed to keep them in place while their rescuers lowered a lifeboat to pull them out of the water safely. Izuku held Katsuki's hand the whole time, refusing to let it go except for when he was lifted out of the water by his armpits by strong coast guards. Once Katsuki was lifted into the boat and they were both wrapped up in heavy wool blankets, they clasped hands again. Izuku was on autopilot the moment they got into the lifeboat. He could hear people talking and asking him questions. He knew he needed to answer, but he couldn't focus on anything besides the exhaustion in every muscle in his body. He couldn't feel anything but Katsuki's strong hand in his. The blonde was staring off into the distance with lifeless eyes. Nothing their rescuers said even graced the edges of their minds. Izuku vaguely remembered when they were pulled onto the boat that it would be a long ride back home. Why? They were only 80 miles away, right? But then Izuku realized that their captors had never actually said which shore they'd been dropped off of. Where had they ended up? Too many questions spiraled around his head. Izuku shut down. He passed out in Katsuki's arms. Waking up was almost a horror story on repeat. How many times had he fallen asleep and woken up in the last 7 days? He'd lived several years in the span of that time. Shaking off the empty, dreamless sleep, Izuku sat up and found himself lying on a bench with Katsuki sitting up best to him. He'd been asleep in his maid's lap, still on the boat that had picked them up. Katsuki's hand was still trapped in his half-dried curls. They hadn't been resting long. "Kaken." The blonde's eyes snapped open, a faint click forming in his throat. Maybe that distant language wasn't completely gone. Izuku tried it, and managed a soft trilling sound. Katsuki smiled and bumped their foreheads together. "Feeling better?" That was Aizawa's voice. Izuku looked around to find their teacher drinking coffee while standing at the railing off to the side. He wore a calm face and his hair was whipping around his head from the wind. He had a huge coat and boots on with his ever-present capture scarf around his neck. Izuku realized everyone on the boat had been in heavy clothes when they got picked up. Izuku was now dressed in warm clothes and didn't remember being put into them. It probably happened when they were dissociated after being picked up, or maybe Katsuki did it later. But he felt a fair deal warmer than he'd been while in the ocean with nothing but spandex shorts on. Izuku finally looked back to Aizawa and nodded a little. "Good, we're almost back to Misutafu. Do you know where you were?" Katsuki and Izuku glanced at each other and shook their heads. You were 80 miles off the coast of Egashima Island, which is another 220-ish miles south of the mainland. Izuku blinked. 300 miles or just shy of it. They'd been nearly 300 miles away from the mainland. He had several hundred questions buzzing around his mind suddenly and he didn't even know where to start. Thankfully, Katsuki managed to form words first. How'd you find us?" "Ah, yes." Aizawa took a long sip of coffee before going on. "A rather strange villain turned herself in on day 4 of the search. We hadn't even realized you'd been taken offshore yet. She admitted to kidnapping you and using her quirk on you at the direction of her villain partner, Variance, who is still at large. She told you everything. Just that you were off the coast of Egashima Island. She didn't know anything else. She said it was some test thought up by that Variance guy. Since Sukachi's quirk said it was true, we didn't waste time. Sadly, we searched the coast for days with no sign, until Katsuki threw up his explosions this morning. You didn't know." Izuku cleared his throat. "What do you mean?" Aizawa set his coffee mug down and found a deck chair across from them. "Didn't know what?" Katsuki wrapped his arms around Izuku. Seeming a little aggravated that someone was getting too close to his pregnant mate, Izuku shook his head. "No, that wasn't real. It wasn't real." Izuku rubbed the palms of his hands to his temples. "They chained us to an anchor, sunk it to the bottom. We were down there for a week, trapped in her quirk, in a coma," he explained. Their teacher closed his eyes and sighed. After a moment, he rubbed a hand over his face. He seemed either horrified or angry, and Izuku couldn't tell which would be worse. Eventually, he looked up and nodded. Okay, can you give me more details? Medical and police are waiting at the docks. We'll be mooring in about an hour or two depending on the tides. You'll be questioned if you can't answer now. You know the drill. This isn't a first kidnapping for either of you. They did, and wasn't that the sad part? They both knew how this worked. They'd be questioned, and if the police or the commission weren't satisfied with their answers, they wouldn't be released. Medical would likely be the longest part of this, considering the quirk changed their lung composition. The dream was a whole other thing that Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to tell anyone about just yet. Can you give us a minute, sensei? Katsuki asked. Ooh, yeah, sure. Their teacher seemed entirely unsure about doing so, but in the end, he walked up to the front of the boat where the Coast Guard and everyone else was. He looked back at them a couple times while speaking, but they couldn't tell what he was saying. Izuku stood up. His legs were wobbly, but he staggered a few feet to the railing so he could lean on it. Katsuki followed and immediately wrapped his arm around Izuku, putting their heads together. They were facing away just enough that Aizawa couldn't read their lips. Izuku knew he could, and so could present Mike, probably better than Aizawa, actually. Do you want to tell them? The blonde whispered. I don't know. We could boil it down. We were chained to the anchor, and knocked out by her quirk. We dreamed of stupid shit and you woke us up. I never did ask how you managed that. Nana, the vestiges. Izuku nodded. They used all their strength to force through the quirk and get to me. Nana convinced me to wake up. It's why I vanished from the dream. Damn. Katsuki put his chin on Izuku's head. That single word sounded more painful than Izuku had ever heard Katsuki be allowed. How bad had it been when Izuku vanished? The sky was cloudy, it looked like rain. He was glad to be out of the water now, and dry for the moment, then immediately felt guilty for feeling good about it. He sighed. Overall, he really didn't want to go back to land. His heart was still out there, buried in the ocean, chained to an anchor, and Izuku didn't know how to reel it back into his chest. We have to tell them something. He finally sighed out. I know, nerd. Let's just stick with the basics. You can even tell them your quirk is what broke us out. After all, it's happened before. Yeah, he muttered back. Izuku. Katsuki pulled his face around so they could look at each other. Talk to me. What's going on? Ever since we got pulled out of the water you've been ... You're not here. Izuku felt the fragile remains of his composure just snap when Katsuki pried. He was never able to resist his mate's worrying tone. Tears poured down his face without regard for their current company. He felt his soul shatter on the deck in seconds. The adrenaline had worn off. He was finally facing the reality that it wasn't real. He didn't have to push aside his thoughts to keep them alive. He didn't have to save his mate from drowning. He was on a boat, on his way home, to a reality that felt years ago and far away. Izuku had left his children in that dream, without him, and nothing could be more earth-shattering than the knowledge that he would never see his precious girls again. That life growing inside of him wouldn't come into being. Izuku was barren, in more ways than one. A whale so cracked and broken it could have sunk the boat they stood on ripped itself from his core. His fingers curled into claws in the blanket around his mate's shoulders. The echo of his screams carried back to him like a dying whale in the deep. Katsuki quickly wrapped him up and pulled them to the floor before Izuku's legs gave out. I can't bear it, Kaken. He sobbed the words like knives from his throat. I can't. She took everything from us. Their teachers and Tsukachi had come running when Izuku cried out. But he didn't have the strength to care if he was heard. She took everything. Our lives, our home, our children. I can't bear it. My heart is still anchored to that damn reef and I want to go back. Please let me go back. I can't leave them. Please. Katsuki rocked him silently. But Izuku could feel the tears dripping on his head and shoulders. His mate was in agony, too. They were both breaking and Izuku couldn't stop it. He couldn't stop himself from falling apart on the boat that was carrying them away from the life they'd both fallen in love with, the life they were both happy living. It wasn't real, Katsuki finally mumbled against the side of his head. Izuku could hear his teeth clenching so hard they were almost cracking. The words were empty, because how could Katsuki believe them? It was a dream. A beautiful, lovely dream. I'm sorry. We can't go back. Why? He pushed Katsuki away, pounded his fists on his mate's chest. Why not? How can you let this happen? How? You're my mate, you're their father. She took them from us. Izuku was screaming, his throat raw and clutching the coat over his stomach, begging the universe to give him back the lives he had been growing, the lives that weren't real outside his mind. They were real to Izuku, and that's all that mattered. The reef, their mating, their two beautiful daughters, their unborn hatchlings, their laughter and happiness, the sunset they watched every single day, the peace and quiet of their lives, it was all too real and Izuku didn't want to leave it behind. Katsuki cupped his face and pressed their tears-streaked faces together in a passionate kiss. It was sorrowful and intimate, and a few of the men around them turned their heads to give them privacy. Izuku tugged on Katsuki's jacket, his forehead falling against his mate's chest when the kiss finally broke. Katsuki gently soothed a hand over his back in circles. I know, he mumbled. I'm so sorry. Aizawa crouched beside them a few moments later and brushed some of Izuku's curls from his face. His voice was softer than Izuku thought possible from the tired old hero. I'm not entirely sure what happened to you boys, but I'm sorry it has caused you so much pain. 5 years, Katsuki growled. What? Aizawa looked up. Izuku closed his eyes, unable to bear the truth. If Katsuki wanted to tell it, then he wouldn't stop the blonde from doing so. We lived almost 5 years down there, in a dream. A very real dream. Her quirk, it makes you believe you've been turned into merfolk. It slowly removes your memories of everything else and makes you believe it's what you've always been. Izuku sniffled. He curled into a ball in Katsuki's arms and tried not to listen to their sad story. We were ... Katsuki took a shaky breath. We were down there several months before our twins were born. Girls. They were beautiful and real. Izuku ... He was pregnant again. The girls were almost 4 when again, he struggled to speak. They were almost 4 when the vestiges finally broke through the quirk and woke Izuku up for real. Then he woke me up and we broke free. 5 years. Hazashi breathed. The words almost carried away in the wind. Oh, you poor boys. The voice hero offered his hand to Izuku and the teen squeezed it gently. Aizawa sighed. What kind of sick, twisted quirk? It's not. Izuku muttered. Aizawa arched his eyebrow. You could use it so kindly. You really could. You could give someone the chance to live a life if they were dying too young. You could give comatose patients a life and maybe wake them up. There's so many ways to use it, Kinla, but she didn't. She knew we'd either die down there, or be ripped out of a beautiful dream and have to live the rest of our lives carrying it with us. Quirks are tools. Katsuki agreed. She used hers to hurt us, that's all. They both knew far too well how wonderful quirks could be and how they could save or benefit lives. But they also knew that a quirk was only as good or as bad as its holder and how they chose to use it. Aizawa told them to rest. Tsukachi confirmed everything they said was true, so they wouldn't be pushing for too much more information since it was clearly painful for both boys to speak about. They were given some food and coffee to warm up. Both of them realized they hadn't actually eaten in a whole week. They were both starving now that the quirk had worn off and they devoured several portions of rice, meat, and veggies. Izuku had like 3 cups of coffee, too. The shoreline came into view shortly after they finished eating. Katsuki had kept himself wrapped around Izuku almost non-stop since their admission of the truth behind the quirk that took them. Izuku was wrapped up in another blanket over his jacket, still frigid from the cold ocean air and far too long in the water. The medic they had on the boat said they were thankfully not hypothermic, but they would likely struggle with temperature control for a few days after their experience since the quirk messed with their regulation ability, or at least as far as he could tell. The docks were cleared, but Izuku could see a huge line of press outside the entrance gates along with a crowd of people. Some were holding up signs that said things like "Bring back our heroes" and "Save Deku" and "Ground Zero." It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. Izuku felt like his life as a hero was years ago, and it really was, for him anyway. Katsuki tucked his arm around Izuku's shoulders and led them off the skiff between their teachers and the detective after they all said their thanks to the Coast Guard that rescued them. The moment they disembarked and they were visible to the crowds, everyone went wild. Cameras flashed. People cried and shouted their hero names. It was a true celebration. But neither of the rescued teens could put on a smile for the people cheering their names. Izuku stared at the ground and Katsuki settled into protective mate mode, wearing his usual scowl and warding off anyone who got too close with a toothy growl. I'll find out who leaked the location. Tsukachi mumbled. It's fine, Aizawa said. It doesn't matter now. Besides, this is the only large search by the Coast Guard in years. It was bound to be public knowledge. Let's get them checked out. President Mike led them to the waiting ambulances while Aizawa and Tsukuachi took care of the press and civilian. There would be no separating them, and the poor EMTs looked a bit bewildered at the way Katsuki guarded Izuku like a wild animal when they tried to touch him. Izuku chirped a couple times, soothing his mate enough that the medics could at least check them both out. But he stayed in angry hover mode the whole time. They were cleared medically and told to report to Recovery Girl for further testing on the effects of the quirk they'd been under, but they were free to go home without medical care. Aizawa got them loaded into a big police SUV. And they spent an agonizing 20 minutes trying to sift through the crowds at 5 miles an hour. It was brutal to sit through the civilians pounding on the car, begging to see their heroes, asking why they wouldn't show their faces. When they were finally free of the crowds, the SUV sped off across Musutafu towards UA High. Izuku remained buried in Katsuki's arms the entire time. But of course, it couldn't be as simple as arriving back to their dorms in peace. There was another wave of crowds waiting outside the school gates, and after another arduous drive through waves of people, they finally got behind closed gates and they thought the battle was over. But of course it wasn't. Izuku shouldn't have assumed they could escape into some semblance of momentary peace without facing their friends, their classmates. The whole of Class 3A, a few teachers, and some of their friends from other classes were all waiting outside their dorm buildings. Several students looked anxious. A couple of the girls were wiping tears from their eyes. Izuku noted that 2 students had hard looks on their faces, Hitoshi and Ijiru. They were standing off to the side, talking with each other, and both had blank, cold looks on their faces. Why? Izuku trilled to get his mate's attention. Katsuki chirped back. He heard the worried tone in Izuku's voice and looked up to Aizawa and shook his head. Aizawa sighed. After a moment, he leaned forward to where Tsukachi was driving and Present Mike was in the passenger seat. Zashi, get the kids inside. This is too much. If they don't live in this dorm, they can stop by later. Right now, I think we just need something a little more low-key. The blonde hero gave them a sad look and nodded. Yeah, I'll warn them to keep themselves controlled. Give me a few minutes, I'll signal. Tsukachi turned the car off and turned around in the driver's seat as Present Mike jumped out and started ushering the group of students back into the dorms. Boys, the detective cleared his throat. One last thing. I'm going to file the report you gave on the boat, but if the commission isn't satisfied, I'll be back for further questioning. Also, your parents have been notified, of course. They can call their parents after they've had a thorough medical exam. We're just at the dorms to get you both a change of clothes and get you cleaned up. Then we're heading over to Recovery Girl. She's waiting for us. Aizawa lifted his eyebrows, asking if they were ready. Izuku nodded and Katsuki squeezed his hand. Katsuki got out first and helped Izuku stumble down. His damn legs were still not working right. Katsuki didn't seem to be doing much better. Aizawa followed suit after a quick goodbye to Tsukachi and tucked his arm over their shoulders. Izuku twitched but didn't shy away. The car had parked right at the end of the front walk to the building. It was maybe 20 feet. This was the longest 20 feet Izuku had ever walked in his entire life. Longer than the walk back to his house after the USJ incident. Longer than any battle he'd ever fought. Longer than the whole damn war they'd fought. This walk was the final goodbye to the life they'd left behind in the ocean. This was acceptance of their reality. The door loomed closer and Izuku could see the faces of their friends in the window. They looked so hopeful, so happy to see them. But those hopeful looks only filled his gut with grief and anxiety, torturous guilt. His legs stopped. Katsuki nearly fell forward. Izuku. He shook his head. I can't do it. I can't do it, Kaken. Aizawa heard them and turned quickly, hiding them from view. You can, Izuku, Katsuki assured. No, his legs were getting weak. No, I can't. Please don't make me do this. Please, my mate, please don't make me. Katsuki shielded him from the dorm, holding his shoulders loosely. Izuku was already on the verge of sobbing for the 1000th time on this incredibly long day. He couldn't face their friends. He couldn't face those hopeful eyes that expected their friends back just as they were when they left, even after the war. After years of enduring the after effects of the hero world shattering, they had taken it all in stride. But this might very well be the straw that broke the camel's back. Izuku shook his head and tried to stumble backwards, but Katsuki pulled him into a hug instead. Get the fucking extras out of the damn windows, Aizawa. Fuck. Stay here. Do not move. Understood. Just go. Izuku tangled his fingers in Katsuki's jacket, trying to hide his emotions in his mate's chest. There was no way he could face all their friends like this. He just wanted to breathe, to lay down, to sleep and dream and never wake up from that beautiful life they had. He could hear Aizawa's shoes slapping the concrete and the door clattering open. The shouts of their classmates filled his head, but Katsuki was quick to cup his hands over Izuku's ears and shut it out. He pulled Izuku's face up until their foreheads were pressed together in that familiar reminder that he wasn't alone. I'm sorry, my beautiful mate. I'm sorry. I want it all back, too. I do. Please know that. He was mumbling into Izuku's forehead, but Izuku could hear him anyway. It was a beautiful dream, but it wasn't real. Perhaps that is cruel, but at least our girls will never die, right? Izuku sniffled and wiped his sleeve over his face while shrugging. It's true, love. They'll never die. They'll grow up in our dreams, and they will be with us forever. Katsuki grabbed a chunk of Izuku's jacket, just over his stomach. And this one can be a dream for our future. When we're married, we'll adopt a little one, or find a quirk so you can have your own, yeah. Does that sound good? Izuku nodded. Yeah. He found himself smiling, just a little. I want that. Then you can do this. He motioned to the dorms. This is just one step on the way to that life we're going to build together. Can you do that? But it's a step away from the life that was just ripped from our hands. I know, Izuku. I know. But it's a step towards our future. We can discuss what that means later. Right now, I need you to take this one step for me. Please. Izuku took a shaky breath, slowly nodding his head. If they could truly have that future for themselves, then he could do this. He took Katsuki's hand tightly and nodded again. He could do it, or he hoped he could. Boys. Katsuki turned to Aizawa at the door and nodded, then tucked his arm over Izuku's shoulders again. Izuku forced his legs forward and they took the last few steps to the front door of the dorms. Izuku leaned his head on Katsuki's shoulder and wrapped an arm around his mate's waist. Aizawa held the door open for them. Their classmates were all sitting or standing calmly in the common room, but more than a few of them inched to the edge of their seats. They looked exactly like they did 5 years ago or, well, a week ago. That was the hardest part to grasp. That all of this, everything that happened, had taken place in only 7 days. For their classmates, they saw Izuku and Katsuki only a few days ago. But for Izuku and Katsuki, they had forgotten their whole lives on land and spent half a decade with nothing but each other, the waves, and the family they made. It was then that Izuku realized he himself had not changed. There was no reason to think he would change physically, but he didn't think the quirk had left them completely unaltered. After all, they could still click and trill after a little bit of rest. Maybe they'd have other abilities now, too. The first of the students to brave the void between them all was Mina. Her hands were tangled together and wringing the joints over and over. "Blasty?" she asked in a frail voice. "That really you?" "Izuku." Shadow stepped out from behind a few of their classmates. "Hey Pinky, icy hot. I don't know if the nerd is up for chit-chat. It's been a long It's been a long week." Aizawa gave Katsuki a warning glance before ushering them to the elevator. "We're just here to get them cleaned up and over to medical for clearances. You can have a reunion once they've had some real rest. Come on, boys." Achako pushed her way to the front, though, and tried to reach out for Izuku's hand. He shied away from his friend and sunk into his mate's careful embrace. Without meaning to, he clicked a few times, asking without words for Katsuki to move them. The blonde nodded. "He'll talk to you later, pink cheeks." "But how did?" The blonde shook his head. "Not now." He leaned down and chirped in Izuku's ear, a comforting reassurance that everything would be okay. Izuku let him lead them onto the elevator. Present Mike came out of the teacher's dorms in the corner and talked with Aizawa quietly for a moment. Their tired teacher mumbled something back and returned to their side. He traveled up the elevator with them. "All right, let's get you cleaned up and over to Recovery Girl." Izuku took the longest shower of his life, with Katsuki directly beside him. Neither of them could stand the idea of being even inches apart for the foreseeable future. They talked quietly while they scrubbed the salt from their skin. Izuku hadn't realized how itchy he'd been from a week's worth of salt trapped in his pores until he was scrubbing himself down with soap. Katsuki carefully shampooed and conditioned his hair, but Katsuki insisted on doing his own because Izuku was an idiot with skin and hair care. That was true enough, and 5 years of Katsuki combing his curls underwater to keep them from tangling had proven that point. Gods, how many of these memories from their dream would pervade his life from here on out? Probably too many to count. Once they were cleaned up, dried, and dressed, Aizawa brought them sandwiches and soda on Recovery Girl's orders since they likely needed a boost to their blood sugar. She was right, of course, and Izuku felt immensely better after eating. The walkout wasn't as hard. The class had all been sent to their rooms with the promise of ordered pizza later. Present Mike waved to them from the door, but he'd been eerily quiet since their rescue. Izuku wasn't quite sure why. Maybe the voice hero sympathized with them in some way, somehow. The medical review was arduous and went on for probably 4 hours. Recovery Girl ran every test she could think of, then ran them a second time. Izuku was nearly passed out in Katsuki's arms by the time they finished, and the blonde himself was half asleep sitting upright. Aizawa eventually had to tell her enough was enough so they could all get some much-needed rest. The rescue crew had found them just after dawn on the 7th day, and it was now almost 11 in the evening. In the end, she cleared them medically, but she had several notes. They were, first and foremost, ordered to eat a low-salt diet for the next 6 weeks. The week underwater drinking nothing but salt water had affected them. It hadn't killed them, she pointed out, like it should have a normal person, but it did put their salt counts way too high. They were supposed to drink half a gallon of water a day for the next week, too, to help flush their body. Secondly, the tongue clicking and trilling they were doing as a form of communication seemed permanent. Their voice boxes had changed shape, and she said if they practiced, they'd likely be able to communicate with dolphins. The way she said it was so nonchalant that it took a moment for it to register. Aizawa sort of forced, or well, less than gently pushed them to bring up the whole Izuku had children in the dream world thing. Recovery Girl gave him a weird squinty eye look and ran a few tests without saying a word. When she came back, she told him that he actually showed heightened levels of estrogen and progesterone, which was nowhere near what a childbearing woman would need, as she put it, but it was very high for a male. She concluded that his body went through psychosomatic pregnancy while in the dream, and that threw his head for a loop. If you wish to pursue children in the future, I have a doctor friend with a sex change quirk that only affects genitalia. I can put you in contact. Recovery Girl's tone was matter of fact, no judgment. You'd do that? Izuku asked shyly. Sweetheart, I've had 3 girls of my own. Do you honestly think I can't see how much pain you're in? Izuku blushed a little. She offered him a soft pat on the head and whispered in his ear, "You come see me if you need someone to talk to about it. I've lost pregnancies, too." He was more than comforted by her warm gestures to help him through what was quickly becoming an awkward transition back to society. Her last note for Izuku was to rest his quirk for a couple weeks. When the vestiges burst through Sea Snake's quirk, it likely put a lot of pressure on his quirk, and since his quirk was inherited through transmission and not genetics, there was no way to know the effects, so it was best to rest for a while. Izuku agreed. She had notes for Katsuki as well, but they were mostly behavioral. She'd noted several of his chemical levels were high, including testosterone, which was making him aggressive and territorial over Izuku, his mate. While that wasn't a bad thing, he could easily get violent given that his quirk made things worse, so until his levels came back down in a few weeks, he'd be on mood stabilizers and a mild quirk suppressant. He was not happy about this, but after Izuku elbowed his ribs, he obliged. They spoke about their strange situation while walking back. "Is it okay if we don't tell the class everything, Sensei?" Izuku asked. "You tell them as much or as little as you want. I won't say anything if that's what you want." He kicked a rock off the path and took a cigarette pack from his pocket and lit one up. This lagged them to a stop for a moment. "The commission will bury this case. Sea Snake is already on her way to Tartarus." Katsuki leaned on Izuku's shoulders and draped his arms over Izuku like he was a living scarf or coat. Izuku tangled his fingers into Katsuki's and rocked back and forth on his heels. "I don't think I want them to know everything. UHM. Not about Kaylee and Nea." "Was that your girls' names?" Shouta asked. They both nodded. "I understand. Look." He flicked the ash on his cigarette and they started walking again. "Your classmates are going to ask. They aren't going to settle for vague answers. But you absolutely do not have to answer any questions. If they bug you too much, tell them to come talk to me." "All right. Thanks, Sensei." Katsuki grumbled. "I think they'll be shocked enough by us just being together." Izuku muttered. "Yeah." Aizawa motioned between them. "This would have been a shock, had I not been the only teacher in the school to put my money on you in the betting pools." "You what?" Katsuki barked. Aizawa laughed openly with a bright smile on his face. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he saw their teacher smile so easily. "Yeah, the teachers bet on a lot of shit. One of the pools is who will get together first. Everyone thought I was crazy, but I'm not stupid. Despite your past, I've seen how you look at each other when you think no one's looking. All that bark, and no real bite against each other." He took another drag from his cigarette. "Thanks, by the way. I won 220,000 yen on that bet." "Seriously?" Izuku asked. "Do we get a cut?" "Huh, you're cute." He patted Izuku on the head. "No." Katsuki snorted. Well, at least Izuku tried. Still, the release of tension was nice. The rest of their walk back to the dorm was quiet, and only a couple people were in the common room. They got back around 11:30, and the next day was a school day, so it made sense everyone was in their rooms. Hitoshi and Ijiru greeted them with soft smiles. Hitoshi lifted his mug of coffee and Iji stood up but hesitated before removing. Katsuki rolled his eyes. "Come here, shitty hair." The redhead lit up and dove towards him. Izuku sidestepped to give him room to tackle and hug the blonde. Izuku chuckled a little and walked over to where Hitoshi was sitting on the couches. Aizawa came over for a second. "Behave, and I'll ignore wherever you both choose to sleep." Izuku nodded, agreeing easily. The teacher pointed to Hitoshi with his still-lit cigarette. "Could he smoke in here? Keep an eye on this one for me, Hitoshi saluted Aizawa. "Yes, sir." The tired teacher rolled his eyes and wandered off into the building, leaving them to fend for themselves for the first time since they got out of the water. Katsuki and Ijiru found a spot to talk in the corner, but Katsuki kept flicking his eyes over to Izuku. "I'm not gonna ask." Izuku looked back to Hitoshi. "I'm not gonna ask what happened. They told us you were kidnapped and taken offshore somewhere. That's all we know. But I won't ask. Do you want to know?" "It doesn't matter, I won't pry." Hitoshi insisted. "That's not what I said." Hitoshi sighed. "We all want to know. Watching you in that car. Through the window ... You're different. Something happened. It's obvious something traumatic happened." Hitoshi looked him up and down. "I can guess it wasn't physical. No wounds and RG didn't keep you. Maybe they made you sit in a soundproof room and listen to your own heartbeat." Izuku bit the inside of his cheek. "No, I think we'd be a little more fucked up if that was the case." He leaned back on the couch. Hitoshi offered his mug of coffee and Izuku took a long pull. God, Hitoshi made the best coffee in the whole dorm. Izuku groaned into the mug and his eyes rolled back in his head. He didn't realize how much he missed something as simple as good coffee. "Well, whatever happened, I'm just glad you're safe." Izuku noted he didn't say he was glad Izuku was back, but that he was safe. "Actually, can I ask you one question?" "You don't have to answer." Izuku shrugged while handing back the coffee mug. "Sure. Did you want to come back?" Izuku let himself fall back onto the couch with a long sigh. Hitoshi was the most observant of their classmates. It was only a matter of time before he pointed out the obvious distress Izuku had upon arriving back at the dorms. The insomniac might appear to be constantly half asleep and surviving off caffeine and spite, but he was incredibly intelligent and often missed less than Aizawa did. Izuku titled his head back and suddenly felt the desperate need to count the stars, or at least be able to see them. He wanted to watch the sunset from under the waves again. His throat let out a soft trill of sad notes as he sighed. Katsuki turned to frown, but didn't yet move towards him. Izuku shook his head to let his mate know he was fine, just sad. Honestly, Toshi, no, I'm still not sure how I'm supposed to just go on with my life like nothing happened. You want to talk about it? Izuku shrugged. He trusted Hitoshi, and knew the purple-haired insomniac wouldn't say anything if Izuku asked him not to. There was no real reason to hide most of it from him. Izuku still didn't want to talk about his daughters, but he felt safe saying some of it. Katsuki was probably doing the same with Aijuru. Katsuki and Iji were best friends, and he knew Katsuki trusted him as well. In short, we were chained to an anchor under the ocean, about 80 miles off the coast of Aijishima Island. You didn't drown with those cement shoes, though. No, one of the villains had a quirk that it changes you, lets you breathe water, puts you in a coma, and steals your memories. Hitoshi didn't say anything to that, just gave him a go-on look, so Izuku did. It's only been a week for all of you. For us, we lived in that dream for 5 years. Hitoshi whistled. Damn, yeah, we had a life, you know. A life, and he bit his lips. It was ripped away suddenly. My quirk broke through the effect and shattered the illusion. Painfully, he rubbed the hem of his shirt between his fingers and tried to smile. But we got to the surface before the quirk wore off, before we drowned. You two really know how to up the ante, huh? Every time you get in trouble, it gets wilder and wilder. Izuku chuckled. Yeah, I guess so. Ugh. Izuku sighed. He slumped on the couch. That's not even the worst part. Hitoshi groaned like an old man trying to get himself up off the couch, and even took an extra minute to stretch. Katsuki and Iji seemed to be finishing up their conversation. Izuku really wanted his mate. This was the longest they'd been separated in years. Come find me when you're ready to talk about that worst part. When you're ready. Izuku stood up and hugged Hitoshi from the side, much to the insomniac's surprise. He took a couple steps to balance himself before wrapping one arm around Izuku's waist. Well, what's this for? Hitoshi asked. You're the first person to just care what I wanted. You didn't say sorry or pity us. You just you're a good friend. Thank you. Hitoshi smiled. Yeah, don't tell anyone. Get some rest. Izuku released him from the hug and wiped a couple loose tears from his eyes. Hitoshi bumped his chin with a finger, silently telling him to keep his chin up, and left. Izuku didn't expect him to be heading to bed, but he knew that was likely more socialization than Hitoshi was used to on a normal basis. Katsuki came over to the couches and took Izuku's hand. He smiled up at his mate and kissed Katsuki's shoulder. Aijuru must have left at some point while he was speaking to Hitoshi, as they were alone in the common room now. Your room or mine? Katsuki asked. Yours. Achako knows the code to my door. I don't trust her not to be waiting on my bed. Oof. I'll ask Aizawa to change the code tomorrow. Thank you, Kaken. Come here. Katsuki pulled him closer and took his chin to press a gentle kiss on his lips. Izuku melted into it. Izuku nuzzled his head into Katsuki's cheek a moment later and kissed where his gills used to lay, right along the side of his neck. I miss them. I know. Katsuki brushed his curls from his face. Come on, let's go to bed and dream of that life. When Izuku woke the next morning, it was to the cold reality that he was back at UA High, in the dorms, still missing half his family. He hoped and prayed that waking up would be easier day by day. He prayed to whatever higher being that might listen that this pain might someday stop clenching his chest every time he opened his eyes. Katsuki was curled around him too tightly to free himself. Their legs were a knot, and oh how he wished those were tails instead. He wriggled his toes and tried to get reacquainted with his new body. This was the first quiet moment to himself since getting free of those chains in the ocean. So he took the time to remind himself what toes felt like, what ankles and knees did, and how they bent and twisted when he asked them to. The sun was streaming into Katsuki's bedroom windows, and after 15 minutes of Izuku exploring his human body, he found the golden ray of morning sun was laying right across his mate's sleeping face, and he couldn't resist the urge to kiss those beautiful eyelids to ask that they open for him. Slowly, those molten red eyes cracked open into the light. Izuku could see glowing rubies inside them, and he wanted nothing more than to let himself dissolve into the magma pools. He kissed Katsuki's forehead, then his cheeks, then one final kiss to his mate's lips, and the blonde wrapped an arm around him. Morning, Katsuki whispered against his lips. Izuku hummed his reply. Their verbal conversation ended there for a while. Izuku chirped a few happy notes while pecking kisses along Katsuki's neck and chest, and Katsuki's reply was a happy purring growl as his back arched off the bed. Izuku sank lower, kissing along each bump of his mate's ribs, then back around to his stomach until he reached the top edge of Katsuki's sweatpants. The blonde grabbed the back of his head gently and offered a quick cut-off trill. Izuku stopped and tilted his head to the larger male beneath him. I don't want to cope like this. What? Izuku sat up, even more confused. I don't want to cope with our loss by having sex. That's not what I was doing, Kaken. Isn't it? Izuku opened his mouth to argue, only for his words to die on his tongue. That hadn't been his original intention, but now that it was pointed out, Izuku slumped back on his butt and looked out the balcony doors at the sunlight. His desire to melt into his mate's arms was a distraction, one that would hopefully make him forget the pain, but he knew that wasn't a good idea. I'm sorry, he mumbled. Katsuki sat up and pulled his face back up. Hey, it's okay. We're both in a bad place. Are we, though? Izuku slapped his hands over his mouth, a bit shocked that he was being so snappy this morning. His partner sighed as he tugged himself up into a proper sitting position. Okay, what do you mean by that? Izuku shrugged. You don't seem that affected. I know it's only been one day, but you just you're so strong. And it kind of feels like you're just fine. You've been carrying me through all of it. Katsuki scoffed. I am far from fine, nerd. I am far from fine. He took Izuku's hand and played with their fingers for a few minutes. He was mulling over his thoughts, and Izuku could see the gears turning. Katsuki had never been good at emotions, but this whole nightmare had really brought out a new side of him. It just hurts too much to focus on. If I let myself focus on what I lost, on what we lost, I think he swallowed hard. I'll shatter on the floor. Izuku tackled his mate, wrapping him up in a hug like he always did for Izuku. Katsuki was his rock, his literal anchor. But for once, Izuku wanted to be the strong one. Katsuki had always been that steady stone, even when they were kids. He'd been the one to pull Izuku up on his feet after busting a knee or falling off the jungle gym. They'd saved each other more times than either of them could count, but Izuku had always been the one to need a shoulder to cry on. Well, Katsuki had likely needed one, but he'd never allowed anyone close enough to ask for help. Time for that to change. As they Izuku soothed. Katsuki wrapped his arms around his waist and buried his face in Izuku's neck. It's okay. You can break. You can shatter. We'll glue each other back together, love. And he did. Katsuki screamed into his shoulder. The sound was muffled enough that it wouldn't wake anyone up, but it vibrated Izuku's ribcage and pulled a choking whine from his throat. He pressed his face into Katuska's messy blonde spikes. In the streaky morning sunlight, Izuku and Katsuki grieved the loss of their home, their children, and 5 years of their lives that weren't real to anyone but them. For the first time in 5 years, Izuku watched the sun rise over the horizon instead of set below it, and he knew, without a doubt, that he was back in the real world. He knew, with a grief-laden heart, that he would hate sunrises for the rest of his natural-born life if he was stuck living it on land. When they'd both calmed down, they curled up on the bed to watch the last of the morning light streaming through the window. Katsuki combed his fingers through Izuku's hair. The fingers of his other hand traced little circles on Izuku's palm. The amber light from the morning sun dyed the walls burnt umber and the tan carpet a deep honey color. Izuku wished so desperately he could hate those colors just like he hated the sunrise. But he didn't. A new day was a beautiful thing. New chances to live the life they wanted. New memories to make. A new day meant time was passing, and they were living it, and not buried beneath the sea. The rise of the sun meant there was no risk of drowning in the dark of the ocean. Izuku should be happy, right? We should get ready. Katsuki whispered. Yeah. Izuku didn't move. The alarm on Katsuki's bedside table hadn't gone off yet. They still had a few minutes before they had to go back to their lives as hero students. Kaken, Katsuki kissed the top of his head and rolled them up into a sitting position. Izuku begrudgingly obliged. What's on your mind? I don't think I want to be a hero anymore. Katsuki didn't even seem shocked by his comment. He slid his legs off the edge of the bed and sighed as if he expected to hear that at some point. But he waited for Izuku to expand on his thoughts. Is it silly that maybe I want to go into marine biology? The blonde laughed, rubbing the last bits of sleep from his eyes. Not at all. I've been trying to decide what I want to do as well. Being a hero has been my only dream, all my life. After the war, that dream started to slip. But now, I don't think I can call myself a hero when I let my own my own children slip away like that. I didn't even fight for them. Oh, Kaken. Izuku cupped his mate's face and shook his head. There was no way for us to fight. I'm so sorry I had to rip you out of the dream. I'm sorry. No, don't you dare think this is your fault. Don't you dare. You saved my life. You saved us both. Don't ever forget that. Izuku wiped his face and nodded a few times. Okay. Katsuki kissed the top of his head as he stood up, but Izuku grabbed his wrist to stop him. One more thing. The alarm went off and the blonde silenced it and sat back down. I want to talk to Sea Snake. What? Don't freak out. I need to know. Izuku insisted. What could you possibly need to know from the bitch who tortured us? Katsuki growled. Izuku stood up, anger already boiling in his gut. What could he want to know? Everything. He needed to know everything. Partially because of his fascination with quirks and partially because he didn't think he could accept that it was all a dream, not forever. What if there's more to her quirk? What if we aren't just human anymore? What if there was some part of it that was real? His voice was raising to a shout, but he couldn't stop himself. What if, Izuku? Katsuki matched his volume. What will that change? Everything, Izuku wailed, shoving his mate out of the way so he could grab some clothes and a towel to shower like he'd originally planned. Katsuki followed him and grabbed his own towel with that usual angry scowl he reserved for everyone but Izuku. It was a dream, Izuku. We need to accept that. Grieving that loss is easier than hoping it wasn't. How? Izuku threw the door open. How is it easier to grieve? Because if it was a dream, then our daughters aren't dead. Izuku's voice hitched in his throat. He was standing just outside the bedroom door. Katsuki was still gripping the frame, his quirk making black marks as it crackled and popped on the wood. Izuku put a hand to his throat, too many emotions choking him, but the anger was too much to swallow. Katsuki wasn't done. I told you last night, if our lives were a dream, then our girls can live forever in our hearts. If the last 5 years were a dream, then you never lost that baby. And I never had to spend 3 weeks searching for you in the ocean before you pulled me out. He sucked in a breath. Fuck. Izuku, I didn't mean tea. 3 weeks. Katsuki had spent 3 weeks alone in the dream while Izuku had been getting the key and releasing them from the anchor. Izuku stepped back when Katsuki tried to reach for him. He'd never planned to tell Izuku. Katsuki had not planned to say he spent a month without Izuku. Their girls went a month without him. Their girls spent a month thinking Izuku had left them. He finally managed to swallow back the emotions burning his throat so he could speak. You had no right to keep that from me, Katsuki. No right. Izuku, I was trying to stop you from feeling more pain. Do you think I can't handle it? He shoved Katsuki in the doorframe, but the blonde stood firm, looming over him with a teary-eyed anger on his features. We withstood that fucking shark attack. I gave you 2 beautiful girls, and almost a third. I hunted with you. I stopped that fucking lionfish from killing Nea when she was 2. Do you think I can't handle more pain than grabbing a lionfish's barb with my bare hands? He pushed his heel against his mate's chest again. Do you? Katsuki Bakugo would not take a weak mate. No, he shouted back. You're not weak. God, Izuku, stop. Just stop. You're not weak. He tried to take Izuku's hand, but the smaller teen backed up and smacked his hands away. Katsuki slumped, his arms dropping to his sides. That's not why I had hurt. It hurt too much, and I didn't want to hurt you anymore. Izuku took a shaky breath and looked away, his arms tangled around his waist and hugging his barren and flat belly. He wanted to rip his clothes, claw his flesh, and let himself bleed out on the floor. His heart was screaming in his chest and his lungs burned. He turned back to his mate and tried to reach out, but a voice stopped him. Izuku. Both of them froze. The sudden sensation of eyes burning into the back of his head made Izuku turn. The hallway wasn't empty. Their entire class was leaning out of their doors or standing along the stairs. Heroes. They were all heroes. And they would always come running at the first sign of trouble, at the first shout, and they'd likely just heard every part of that argument. Every word Izuku and Katsuki screamed at each other. Katsuki was quick to pull Izuku back towards the dorm in an effort to protect him. Go back to your rooms. None of you heard any of that, understood? When no one moved or spoke, he raised his voice. Am I understood? A few of their shyer classmates scurried off, but not everyone left. Hitoshi, bravest of them all, or perhaps dumbest, walked over with a blank look on his face. He held out a hand to Izuku while watching Katsuki. The guardian blonde was growling in the back of his throat. Quit it, Hitoshi grumbled. You two need to cool down. Let me get Izuku ready for the day. IG, take Blasty to the first floor showers. All right. The redhead skipped over after a moment's hesitation and looped a hand into the towel on Katsuki's arm. Come on, Izuku. Again, Katsuki growled at the class insomniac. But Izuku pushed away from his mate. He's right, Kaken. I need some air. I'll meet you in a bit. Katsuki's shoulders finally relaxed and he took a few slow breaths to calm himself down. He needed his medications. And Izuku would remind him in a bit once he had a chance to shower and get ready. It wasn't likely Katsuki would forget, though, so he didn't worry too much. Katsuki kissed the top of his head and let Ijiru cart him off to the first floor. Hitoshi took his hand and led Izuku to the bathroom just down the hall, still on the 3rd floor. Hitoshi was gentle and kind with him. He didn't stay too close, but he sat out in the bench area while Izuku showered. He read aloud from the Hero Handbook for their Foundational Heroics class, dumb little tidbits and facts that made Izuku chuckle. It was a nice way to relieve the stress of the argument. Once Izuku was dried and dressed, he felt a lot better and he'd had some time to really think about what they'd said to each other. Maybe he shouldn't have brought up speaking to Sea Snake so soon. That was probably not a good idea. He'd apologize when they had a moment together. So, Hitoshi drew his attention from the buttons on his shirt. That's what you meant by worse, huh? Izuku tilted his head. You had a life, 5 years with Katsuki in that dream. You had a family. You had children. Izuku nodded. Twin girls, Kaylee and Nea. And before we left, I was pregnant, a few months along. I didn't know how many or what genders or whatever. So you lived 5 years in a coma dream together, built a life and a family, and had all of that ripped away from you right before drowning in the ocean where you were chained to an anchor at the bottom. That pretty much sums it up. Yeah, Izuku sighed. Damn, so what started the shouting match? Though, Izuku blushed. That was my fault. I told him I wanted to speak with the villain sea snake. It was her quirk that put us in that coma to begin with. Yeah, I can see why that set him off. What was your reasoning? Izuku appreciated how upfront Hitoshi was. He didn't beat around the bush and he asked straightforward questions. He assumed that was because his quirk required him to be incredibly manipulative. Izuku knew Hitoshi struggled with self-confidence and acceptance around his quirk, so he was always careful not to let others think he was as cruel as his villainous quirk might lead them to believe. Maybe there's more to her quirk than we thought. Maybe it wasn't all made up. After all, Recovery Girl found both of us had raised hormone levels in accordance with our respective dream roles, or whatever. I had heightened levels of estrogen and progesterone, and Katsuki's testosterone is through the roof. That's why he's so growly and protective of me. Hitoshi snorted. That tracks, but you do have a point. I don't really agree that you should speak with your torturer so soon, but if it might give you closure on the whole matter, then maybe it will be good for you both in the end. Izuku draped his towel over his shoulder and Hitoshi stood up to follow him out of the bathroom. They agreed to eat lunch together and said their goodbyes before they got back to Katsuki's room. The room wasn't empty though. Izuku could hear Ijiru and Katsuki speaking before he opened the door. Don't you think you both deserve to know why? What's she gonna say? That she's sorry. Everyone's already said that and it doesn't fucking help. If her why is some pathetic villain excuse, it won't give either of us closure. What's the point? What if Izuku's right? What if there's more to the quirk? Don't tell me you think we could just poof, turn back into mermen and swim off to live our happy lives. That's insane. Izuku slumped against the doorframe. Even if Katsuki had said he wanted the dream back, he'd never said he wanted to return to the ocean in this life like Izuku had. It wasn't like that was unreasonable. They had lives and families here. After all, they should want to stay. So why was Izuku so defeated when he heard his mate say it was insane to go back? He sighed softly and turned to head to his own room. Who cares if it's insane, Kat? Tell me, right here, right now, that you wouldn't give everything up to go back to the ocean. Tell me that and I'll drop it and side with you against speaking to Sea Snake. Izuku stopped. Now that was a question he doubted he would ever be brave enough to ask, but damn did he want to know the answer to it, more than anything. Chewing on his lip, Izuku shifted from foot to foot as he waited for Katsuki to gather his thoughts and answer his friend. Don't even go there, Iji, you know damn well what I want. Then say it, because if you can't say it to me, you sure as hell won't ever say it to Izuku, and I think he needs to hear it more than anyone. Izuku heard Katsuki growl in frustration and something got shoved across the room, likely a chair or laundry hamper. I want it all back. Is that what you want to hear? Of course I do. When he disappeared, I swore I was going to die. I had to watch our girls cry and sob for their da. I searched the ocean for weeks. I thought he was dead. My 2 little girls had to grieve him with this emotionally constipated asshole of a father, and it was horrible. Even when I woke up, I wanted nothing more than to take us both back, regardless of knowing we'd drown. Izuku could just barely hear the pain in his mate's voice. He wanted so badly to go in there and comfort him, but he needed to hear this. It might be wrong to eavesdrop, but he couldn't bring himself to confront Katsuki about the situation. It hurt too much for both of them. But if I entertain the hope that we could go back, I'm letting us both open up to the possibility of more pain. Izuku doesn't deserve that. It was a beautiful dream, and I will grieve for it for the rest of my life. Why do I sense another but coming? Ijiru grumbled. But what if we can go back? What if there is more to her quirk? Would that be so bad, Kat? Last time we weren't given a choice, Iji. We were thrown into it. Traumatically, I might add. Izuku was sure that part of this would come up in therapy. They were rather violently assaulted by Sea Snake's kiss and then drugged backwards on a boat offshore. Yeah, that could qualify as traumatic. If we got to choose this time, we'd be saying goodbye to everything we've ever known. All our friends, our families, our lives here. I won't ask Izuku to do that, no matter how bad I want it. Kat, what if that's what he wants, too? Don't be stupid, shitty hair. He loves his friends and his mom. He's the symbol of peace. He'd never give that up. He'd never want to leave all that for me, for a dream. You're the biggest idiot I've ever met, Katsuki Bakugo. The door was opening before he could react, so he pretended to be walking up to it the second Ijiru was pulling it open. You should just ask him. The redhead blinked. Sorry, Iji. He made a show of rubbing his still wet curls with a soft smile on his face. Oh, ask me what? Nothing, Katsuki grunted. We're going to be late. The walk to class was quiet but not awkward. They settled into a peaceful silence that Izuku was content to relax his shoulders into while they walked. Most of their classmates had already left by the time they walked out of the doors, but their teacher was right behind them. He was far enough away that they could talk if they wanted to and he wouldn't hear them, but close enough that he could keep an eye on them, which Izuku assumed he was doing. The teacher hadn't even asked if they were ready to go back to classes yet, but after multiple kidnappings and even more battles fought over the country and quirks, they were more than accustomed to how this worked. There was a routine, even if there likely shouldn't be for this sort of thing. It was Katsuki's voice that broke the silence right before they went into the school building. Aizawa stopped dead in his tracks when he heard the blonde's comment. "Sensei, we want to speak with Sea Snake about her quirk. Is that what you two were shouting about this morning?" "If it was," Katsuki grumbled. Aizawa shrugged. "Long as we're all on the same page." He glanced at Izuku, who nodded quickly in agreement. "I'll arrange the meeting. It might take a few days. And don't expect it to be easy or private. You'll both likely have to go to Tartarus to see her. Just set it up, old man." Izuku was yanked into the school building before he could even add to the conversation, but the smile on his face was genuine enough that Aizawa didn't seem to be worried about him being dragged off. When they were almost to the classroom, Katsuki stopped them in the hallway and reached over to brush a thumb across Izuku's cheek. "I love you, my little mate. I'm sorry I got upset." "I'm sorry, too, Kaken. I love you." Izuku cupped Katsuki's hand on his face and enjoyed just a few seconds of peace before their lives became chaos again with school, training, and awaiting their meeting with Sea Snake. On Saturday, Izuku, Katsuki, and Aizawa were piled into a tiny elevator on the way down into the depths of Tartarus prison. Izuku was clinging to his mate, terrified they wouldn't let him leave after they were done. Of course, that was a silly worry, but his anxiety thought it was pretty obvious they wouldn't allow him to leave since he was both All Might's powerful successor and now some kind of weird mutated being after being exposed to Sea Snake's quirk. Katsuki rubbed a thumb across his crooked knuckles to soothe him while intently watching everything the guards did around them. The walk from the elevator to the interview room on subfloor 8 took far too long in Izuku's opinion. The guard leading them had a giant gun which Aizawa assured them was a tranquilizer gun, but neither hero student was dumb enough to believe that. As third-year students, Snipe Sensei had already given them a firearms course. Yeah, they knew what an automatic rifle looked like. Granted, Aizawa seemed to be saying it more for the guards' benefit than theirs, so they faked their reassurance at his words. When they arrived at a large glass window in a row of interview rooms, Izuku found Sea Snake calmly sitting at the table she was handcuffed to. Her once short pixie-cut blue hair had grown out almost to her shoulders, which seemed a little fast for only a week. Was it part of her quirk? Izuku analyzed her from a distance immediately. The scales that trailed along her cheeks were still there, which would likely mean they were part of her skin, so her quirk was partially mutant in some regard. But they knew, all too well, that her quirk was a transformation type which took place in the target victim. It didn't really make sense, and was likely incredibly rare, but the more Izuku found out about her quirk, the less he understood. "She's actually one of our best-behaved inmates. She's earned privileges," the guard explained. "What kind of privileges?" Aizawa moved in front of his students, hands tucked in his pockets in a passive manner. Izuku knew this was a threat, a protective stance. The guard wouldn't. "As you can see, she isn't required to wear the usual collar. She's being moved down to Gen Pop in a couple days." "I see. Interesting. Well, she did turn herself in and cooperated completely with the police. She didn't appear to have any intentional harm in her goals like her villain partner did." The guard motioned them forward and Aizawa stepped aside so Katsuki and Izuku could approach the door. "All right, there's a few rules. 1. These bands stand on you at all times when interacting with inmates. They monitor your life signs and let us know when you are actively under the effects of a quirk. Guards wear them 24/7 on duty." He snapped thin bracelets around Izuku and Katsuki's wrists. Izuku could see a matching one on the guard, but his bracelet had a small panel with his initials and rank listed on the screen. The ones he placed on them only had a little blinking green light. Aizawa was given one as well. "I'm coming in with you, no ifs, ands, or buts." Izuku and Katsuki both nodded. They knew better than to argue that kind of tone from their teacher. Nope, that was his "I will murder anyone for my students" tone he reserved for the League of Villains and AFO himself. Rule number 2, you are not to touch the inmate at any time. If she tries to touch you, you'll be pulled out and she will be injected with a sedative. Rule 3, you can discuss anything except current events. The inmates are forbidden to know what is happening in the news. Izuku glanced at his mate. Katsuki was fiddling with the bracelet while trying to look relaxed. He would have believed the act if he couldn't see the thin line of muscle across the back of Katsuki's neck tensing so hard his ears were twitching every so often. Rule 4, you are being recorded, voice and video. Anything you or the inmate say or do can be used in the inmate's case if it is not yet closed. If you commit any crime while in this building, You will be remanded to the police. If you break any rules, you will be immediately escorted off the premises and reported to the commission. I am legally obligated to tell you that breaking these rules is not a crime, but you will be barred from prison visits for 6 months per infraction." He waved a hand and went on. Rule 5, last one. No quirk use. Plain and simple. Noted. Katsuki groused. Izuku bowed his head politely. "All right. Have fun, kiddos. Behave." The door whooshed open and they all filtered in minus the guard. He closed the door behind them and Sea Snake looked up. She seemed genuinely shocked to see them in her interview room. But the confusion turned to sorrow pretty quick as she averted her eyes. "What was that about? You're not my lawyer. Why are you here?" Aizawa took up a position in the corner, observant and silent, a better guard than Izuku could ever imagine having. Really? With a sigh, he decided to take a seat across from Sea Snake. It suddenly occurred to him that he didn't know her real name. Thankfully, it was on her prison scrubs in black embroidery atop the orange fabric. Katsuki stood beside him, leaning over the other chair with his hands on the back of it. He gave Izuku a small nod as if to reassure him he could ask what he wanted. Izuku smiled back and folded his hands on the table politely. We had some questions for you, Tadashi-kun. Just call me Miri." She looked up. "What do you want to know?" "Well, sorry, I didn't expect you to be so cooperative. I never meant to hurt you guys. I hope you know that." Variant said it was a test, but 4 days into it he refused to give me your location. He kept wanting to push it farther and farther. I've never used my quirk like that before." "What did you use it for, then?" Katsuki asked. "I grew up in the circus. My parents both had quirks similar to mine, but mine's more complex. I did an aquatic act, and people could pay to breathe underwater for a short time. I won't give you my whole life story, it's not important. The point is, I've only ever used my quirk to let little kids roam around a fake coral reef, stuff like that. I experimented, I knew what I could do, but I'd never used it harmfully." "Then why did you do it?" Izuku leaned forward a little, making sure to stay well out of her reach for now, to follow the rules. "After the nightmare we went through in the war, I agreed with Variance. I wanted to make sure the next generation of heroes would be strong. They had to be good, and they had to see through illusion. They had to want to save lives more than being blissfully ignorant. Do you get it now?" Izuku slumped back in his chair. Variance had picked her for a reason. He'd targeted her quirk as much as he had targeted the top 2 hero students. So, she was almost as much of a victim as they were, but she wasn't saying it. Hell, she could use that as a defense to get out of this horrid prison, but she wasn't. Izuku would ask why, but he was pretty sure the guilt was eating her alive. "I can see them, did you know that?" "What?" Izuku looked back at Miri. Her hands were wringing out her fingers in the cuffs, over and over, until they cracked painfully. Izuku rubbed his hands together to warm them a little and try to ease the sympathetic pain he was feeling there. "I can see the dreams of those under my quirk." Katsuki slammed his fist on the table with a loud growl. Izuku jumped. Aizawa had a hand on the blonde's shoulder in seconds. Miri barely flinched, which shocked Izuku a little. You knew we were living a perfect fantasy. And you still let us be ripped away from it. How could you give us a dream that good and then just just tear it away?" Izuku placed a hand on Katsuki's to try and help calm him. Miri sighed. "I don't command the dreams. Whatever you two shared wasn't of my creation, nor within my control. You made it all on your own. My quirk only facilitates the dream state and prevents drowning for up to a week. It also took away our memories," Izuku pointed out. "Actually, it doesn't. It distracts you from reality, keeping you in a blissful state. But that only starts after a day or 2. My quirk is safe as just a water-breathing quirk for the first 24 hours. I've done extensive safe testing on that. However, if you choose to forget, it's quite unpleasant when reality crashes back in. I'll say." Izuku sighed, rubbing a growing headache behind his temple. "I'm sorry, truly. Your dream was by far my favorite. I wish so bad that I could have stopped you from being so heartbroken when you woke up. It was beautiful. And I wish so terribly that I could give it back to you. So you can't." Izuku curled his hands into little balls on the table to contain his hurt. "You can't put us back in the dream. Well, I doubt I'll ever use my quirk again while in here. Either way, no, not for sure. I could put you back into a coma, but that would only net you another week underwater. It wouldn't be forever, and there's no way to know if you would have the same dream." Katsuki collapsed into the chair with a heavy puff of air forced from his lungs. It was more than a sigh, bigger and deeper. Some broken piece of him just spilled on the table, and Izuku didn't dare try to pick it up for fear of shattering it even more. "That's why you came here, then? You wanted to know if you could go back." Izuku shrugged. "We gave up 5 years of our lives, 2 children, a pregnancy, and happiness. Wouldn't you want to at least ask if it were possible?" "Yeah, I guess so." The interview room fell silent for a while. Katsuki was staring off at the two-way mirror, probably glaring at the guard outside, though they couldn't see him. Izuku repeatedly rubbed the hem of his shirt while Aizawa paced the room softly behind them. Finally, Miri spoke again. "I can't give you what you want, but I know who might be able to. The hell are you talking about? Izuku sat up at Katsuki's question, curious about it as well. Maybe there was something else to her quirk or someone else like her. I told you, my quirk is more complex than my parents' quirks. My father has a water-breathing quirk which allows him to provide underwater meditation for a short period. My mother's quirk is another beast entirely. I've only seen her use it once on a girl who begged on her knees. Miri sighed. She had to lean down to her cuffed hands in order to itch her face. She can turn people into merfolk permanently, but unlike mine, it doesn't lock your quirk away. It also allows you to split and join tails like the myths of Selkies shedding their skin to walk on land. But it's only every few days. There's a lot more to it, but you can ask her. She still works for the same circus. That sounds too good to be true, Aizawa said. I know, but there's a lot of negatives to it. A lot. Turning someone, or in this case, two people, would likely put her in a coma for days while she recovered. There's also the matter of the quirk's transformation itself. While it is permanent, you would become sort of amphibian. Like I said, you can form legs every few days to walk on land. However, you'd be restricted greatly. If you dry out, you'll die. If you don't change back every 3 days, you'll die. There's more, I don't know everything. But it restricts your language, your breathing, everything. It's not pleasant either, the initial transformation or any of the shifts after. You said she used it once on someone who begged for it. Tell me about that. Well, Miri looked up to Aizawa, focusing on him since Izuku and Katsuki were both a little dazed and shocked. It was one of the younger circus girls. She wasn't talented. Her parents were jugglers, clowns mostly. Poor thing had no talent for it. Well, if you don't have an act, you tend to get ostracized. She'd always been obsessed with the ocean, and used my quirk a lot in her free time. She was quite good at underwater theatrics and acrobatics. She begged my mother to turn her. After weeks of it, my mother caved. She became our mermaid attraction. She's still there. You could speak to her. I might do that. No, I meant them. Miri motioned to Izuku. Only those who have been under my quirk or my mother's can speak the language. The girl never shifts. She only speaks mer. These two can still speak it. Recovery girl was right. Izuku gasped. So we won't lose that? Miri shook her head. Just takes practice when you're on land. You'll get it back. How would we even begin to convince her mother to help us? Izuku was hesitant to try, but he had to find out more. Izuku, Aizawa warned. This is something very serious to consider before jumping in, literally. I know that, sensei. But if I'm going to speak with her mother, I need to know everything. I need to know if she would even consider helping us. She knows what I did to you both. I told her everything. It's also been on the news. Sorry, we can't talk about that. Anyway, she'll know who you are. Tell her you spoke to me. Tell her that if she's willing, I want you both to have your dream back as much as possible. I cannot bring back the family you had, but you could still find your happiness in the water if you wanted to. She sighed deeply. Tell her Miri sent you. It's not my real name. It's not on any records. She was the only one who called me Miri, her little Miri flower. Thank you. Izuku slid a hand across the table but stopped halfway. He couldn't touch her. If he broke the rules, they'd get kicked out. So he leaned back in his chair and took mental notes. Miri told them her mother's name and the circus she worked at. She told them more about the transformation quirk and about her own. Izuku finally felt like he understood what happened to them, even if that didn't take the hurt away much at all. There was a lot to discuss when they left, but Izuku and Katsuki would need to have that conversation in private and hopefully not end up in another argument. The walk back to the entrance was long and they didn't get to remove their bracelets until they made it to the front door. Aizawa ushered them out quickly, clearly wanting away from the prison just as much as they did. He didn't speak until they were halfway back to campus. Do me a favor, say goodbye to the people who deserve it. I don't care how, just don't leave without saying goodbye. Katsuki slipped his arms around Izuku's shoulders and placed one gentle kiss behind his ear. Izuku nuzzled his mate's face and purred in the back of his throat. The car made a sudden turn away from campus. Izuku and Katsuki shared a concerned look, but Aizawa didn't say anything. And they didn't ask. The car was silent until they arrived at the Miracle Meadows Circus parking entrance. Aizawa switched off the car and turned around in his seat. He wore a sad smile and Izuku swore he was holding back tears. You two were the best heroes I ever taught. I'm so proud of you. Izuku dove forward and hugged his teacher between the seats of the car. Aizawa embraced him tightly. You saved this country more times than I can count, more times than I ever did. You will always be heroes, but you deserve to be happy. You both deserve to be happy. So go, find your dreams. When the car doors slammed shut, Katsuki leaned into the driver's side window and smirked at Aizawa. They shook hands and the blonde whispered a soft goodbye, sensei, before the older hero drove off without looking back. No, Tadashi-san's voice shattered the remaining hope Izuku had in his chest. It was fragile and small and she'd just crushed it in his fist with one word. Katsuki and Izuku were standing in one of the tents at the Miracle Meadows Circus in Musutafu. Miri's mother was a beautiful woman with raven hair covered in iridescent streaks that lit up in the sunlight streaming through the tent flaps. She had far more scales than Miri, and they framed her face and limbs beautifully. Her expression, however, was stern. They hadn't said more than hello and introduced themselves before she denied them. I know who you are. I know what my daughter did to you. But no, whatever it is you want, no. Katsuki wrapped an arm around Izuku's shoulders, keeping him upright when the smaller teen's legs started to wobble. The blonde was trying to keep his anger in check, but his muscles were tensing around Izuku. I don't have money. I don't care if you tell the media who I am or what she did. I'm not a part of whatever madness she might have created. Please, leave. Wait. Izuku cleared his throat. We don't want any of that. She told us to come to you. Who? The woman was shifting back a little, apprehensive. Miri told us to come find you, and that if you were willing, she wanted us to have a chance to get our dream back. You spoke to her. They won't let me see her. The woman took a few quick steps towards them. Izuku nodded. Katsuki cupped the back of Izuku's head, twisting a little to put himself between them, perpetually the guardian. Our teacher pulled some strings. Katsuki explained. We asked her if she could ... if any part of the dream was real. She said she couldn't help us, but maybe you could. The woman sucked in a breath and looked down at her hands. She had one large scale on the center of each palm. They glittered pink and blue in the light, the colors shifting back and forth across the black surface. I could. No, I can't. It would be permanent. Did she tell you that? Izuku nodded. She explained how it works, mostly. The risks, the requirements. We understand it would be irreversible, and that we'd only be able to be on land every few days at most. And the risks of doing so. You'd be giving up your entire lives. And you're just children. We're 18, Katsuki said. This is what we both want. Izuku squeezed his hand. We had a life in that dream. A family. We lived 5 years, had 2 beautiful children and another on the way. Then, it was all ripped away from us. Miri said our dream had become her favorite. She apologized for what she did and explained why. Foolish child, Tadashi-san grumbled. It's not her place. She sighed and rubbed a hand over her face. You've given it thought, then? This is what you both want. No regrets. No regrets, Katsuki repeated. Yes, it's what we want, more than anything. The woman nodded a few times. She was thinking it over while chewing on the inside of her lip. After a few moments, she nodded once more and motioned them to follow her. Katsuki and Izuku shared a questioning look but followed her into the back of the tent. Or well, it was the back exit of the tent which was connected with another. The room was some kind of sitting area, though it could also be her living quarters. Katsuki sat himself on the couch, but Izuku decided to look around at all the beautiful hanging items. The tent was full of sea glass and shells made into wind chimes and hanging decorations. Each one was themed and color-coded, and Izuku could see the work and love that went into each one. Miri made those. Every year for my birthday I'd find another one hanging up. This is the first year I won't get one. When is your birthday, Tadashi-san? Please, call me Kid. My birthday is in March. Izuku nodded. He'd sat down with a pitcher of water and a few cups, pouring them each a glass. When she spoke next, she had swapped to a language Izuku didn't think he'd ever heard again, a language that was suddenly so easy to understand yet so foreign on land. You are the only ones to experience her quirk for longer than 24 hours. Katsuki shifted on his seat to watch Izuku. The smaller teen moved over to the couch and put his hands on Katsui's shoulders, so his mate would be less antsy. It was a tough ask to shift his tongue and throat back into the necessary shape to speak the language of the ocean, but he managed. It was a beautiful dream, Kid-kun, but we'd like it to be more than a dream. Katsuki added. He'd poured them all some water and placed 2 cups in front of them on the table at the center of the room. Then, she popped the scale off her left palm and snapped it in half. Izuku almost cried out at the horror of watching that beautiful scale shatter in 2 pieces. She gave Izuku a reassuring smile and crumbled each half into the glasses of water. You are both very kind men. I can tell you do not resent what my daughter did. But, at the end of the day, she hurt you. I believe it should be partially my duty to repair the harm which was done. Izuku rounded the couch and sat down with Katsuki. His mate sat forward and watched what Kid was doing intently. If this is truly what you want, drink the whole glass. In 12 hours, your wish will be granted. You will be permanently turned into merfolk. I will have Asami meet you in the water at the docks. She can teach you everything you need to know. Is Asami the girl you turned when Miri was young? Izuku asked. He'd nodded. Yes, she's not the first person I've turned, but she is the last. Before you, she can teach you. When she doesn't have shows, she stays in the ocean. I think she will be happy to have friends like you. If we do this, will Izuku be able to ... Can we make a family? He'd softened her smile a little and nodded. Yes, when I was young, I accidentally turned a few people. As far as I know, they've traveled the world's oceans all these years and populated the ocean with their kind. My quirk creates interchangeable genders, if you catch my meaning. Izuku nodded. Miri said this would hurt you. It will exhaust me. I almost died when I had that quirk accident as a child. 5 people, but 2 will just knock me out for a few days. It's all right. So long as you are sure it's what you want, I will happily offer my power. Katsuki pulled his face sideways, away from Kid. He cupped Izuku's cheek and pulled him in for a gentle kiss. Izuku clutched the front of Katsuki's jacket. The hope and longing in his heart was pushed into that kiss. This was a final decision, an irreversible choice. If they did this, there was no going back. This would be the last time they were human. They would be giving up their dream of being heroes. They'd be saying goodbye to their family and friends and the whole surface world. Katsuki brushed his curls back and smiled. I promised you we'd make it real, didn't I? Izuku nodded. You did. He sniffled. I want this. I want to go back to the ocean. Katsuki kissed his forehead softly. Good. I do too. He turned back to Kid. Okay, we're ready. Kid motioned to the glasses. The water was sparkling with iridescent glitter. The scale pieces dissolved into the water while they were talking. Izuku and Katsuki both picked up their glasses. Without even thinking, they crossed their arms as if it were a handfasting and tipped them up to drink. Izuku chugged the glass of glittery water. A cool rush of tingles ran down his throat and spine. It will be as painful as Mary's dream made it seem. I can't change that. You've got 12 hours from now to get in the water. I wouldn't suggest shifting back for at least a month so your body can get acclimated. I truly hope the 2 of you can find your happiness, and I hope one day you can forgive my daughter. When they left the circus, they walked back to the train station slowly, hand in hand. The sky opened up and a crack of thunder announced the sudden downpour of rain. Izuku yelped at the cold rush of rain soaking his head. Katsuki burst into laughter and held a hand over Izuku's head, as if that could stop the rain. Kaken, what? He suddenly grabbed Izuku around the waist and lifted him up with a spin. Izuku shrieked, but his mate didn't stop spinning them around in the sudden thunderstorm. Tipping his head to the sky, Izuku pressed little kisses along his mate's chin. We're doing it. We're actually doing it. We're going back home. Katsuki sucked in a deep breath and sighed into the wind. Home, he agreed. Katsuki flipped Izuku around and carried him to the train station in a piggyback ride. They chatted about all the plans they had for setting up a home in the ocean. They decided they'd find a reef they loved. Maybe ask Asami about the other mer that were turned when Kid was a child. Maybe they'd just go out on their own and explore the world's oceans before settling down. They had options. They could live without the insanity and madness, without villains and heroes, without being the symbol of peace or the competition of pro-hero life. They had chosen their new dream, and they were going to reach it. They were going home. Izuku tucked his hands in his pockets in an effort to protect himself from what he assumed would be an implosion of emotions after explaining the whole story to Hitoshi. He really should have known better though, because the purple-haired insomniac's reaction was to crack a devious grin. They were out on Hitoshi's balcony, which faced the back of campus, so they had some privacy. The whole explanation took probably 40 minutes just to get through as he finally went into all the details. Hitoshi flipped around and leaned his back against the railing while bumping his shoulder into Izuku's arm. Brushing him off, Izuku groaned. Don't say it. Don't say what? Hitoshi asked. You know damn well. Don't you dare say it. What? Oh, oh, you mean I told you so? Is that what you don't want me to say? Izuku groaned dramatically and flopped his head on the railing. Stewp. Oh, come on. Hitoshi laughed. Izuku rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. You told me to go for it. Talk to our torturer, and yeah, it worked out. He shoved Hitoshi again, which only made his friend laugh harder. But you don't have to rub it in my face. TCK. Hitoshi shoved him back. Let me have this one thing. He sighed. I'm not gonna see you again, am I? What? Izuku shook his head. No, that's not, you will see us again. I promise. We aren't leaving forever. Izuku, be honest. If not with me, then with yourself. You don't want to come back, do you? He didn't give Izuku time to answer. Admit it to yourself, not to me. If I see you again someday, that'd be great, but I won't be mad about you going off to find your dreams, you know. It might have even inspired me to find mine. I thought you wanted to be a hero. I mean, don't you want to show all those assholes you're not a villain? Sure, Hitoshi grinned. But there's more than one way to do that. Maybe I'll become a sailor and find your ass in the ocean one day. Maybe you'll end up in my net. Yeah, right. Izuku chuckled. You never know. Hitoshi pushed his hair out of his face and smiled into the slowly setting sun that lit up his face and made him squint. You better go. You're running out of time. Yeah. Oh, one more thing. Tell everyone I said goodbye. I don't have the strength to face them all or explain this to everyone. Just just let them know that I am grateful for their friendship and I'll miss them. Of course. Hitoshi pulled Izuku into a hug. It lasted longer than their usual hugs. Hitoshi was not a touchy-feely person, but this had to be an exception. Goodbyes were always an exception, but Izuku never did say goodbye to Hitoshi, not in so many words. Instead, he hugged his friend so tight he'd never forget the way Izuku's arms felt around him. Izuku imprinted himself on Hitoshi, if only to console himself in the process. Hitoshi never left the balcony. He didn't walk Izuku to the door. He stayed out there watching the sunset, with hues of orange and purple washing into the room and covering his body. Izuku tried his best to paint that image of his friend in his mind, so he'd never forget the way he looked in this moment, or the soft smile on his lips. Izuku stood on the end of the pier with his face to the darkened sky. The chilly wind blew his curls to the side, whipping them around his head into knots. Soon, those curls would be floating around him in the water. Izuku was at peace. He'd said goodbye to his friends, his teacher, he'd left a note for his mother. Izuku couldn't face her. Inko would never understand his decision. She'd never wanted him to be a hero. She surely wouldn't think he could survive in the depths of the ocean. He'd visit them all someday. But right now, he needed to be in the water with his mate, to be safe, to be home. Asami had met them at the pier as promised. She was below him, clinging to the pillars a few feet below the water. They'd spoken for a while about all the specifications of the quirk and what would happen shortly. Asami had been a mermaid for most of her life, so she didn't remember the pain of the original shift, but she did mention it was quite agonizing to change every so often. Izuku was not afraid of the coming pain. Katsuki walked up behind him with a small bag. Earlier, he'd visited his family to say goodbye. His parents promised to give Izuku's note to Inko. They'd given Katsuki a few keepsakes to bring with them as well as some supplies. Katsuki had gone to fetch a submersible safe so they could store their phones when they weren't near land. Katsuki's parents insisted they keep their phones, even if both Izuku and Katsuki wanted to get rid of them. So, they'd leave the safe with their phones chained up near the pier for when they came to visit. They did plan to visit. Izuku's mate wrapped his arms around him and kissed the side of his head from behind. Izuku rocked them back and forth. He pointed to one of the brightest stars in the sky. I want to follow that one. Yeah, Katsuki asked. Where to? Anywhere, everywhere. Katsuki grinned. Which one will we follow to find our way back? Izuku turned, forcing them into a tightly curled hug. He slipped his hands up along Katsuki's cheeks to press their foreheads together one last time before they dove into their new lives. He closed his eyes for only a moment before running his thumbs across Katsuki's cheekbones. Right here. Your eyes are my lighthouse. I can always find my way back to shore so long as you are there. This is how I find my way home. Asami called them, reminded them it was almost time, that they needed to get in the water. Katsuki pecked his forehead and tossed the bag in his hand into the water past the pier. Ready, my beautiful mate. Izuku let a joyous grin spread across his face. Let's go home, Kakin. Katsuki grabbed him around the waist and lifted him into the air. The blonde spun them around as if he were dancing, closer and closer to the end of the pier. Izuku brushed those wild ash blonde spikes back from his mate's face and peppered it with kisses. The last flickers of sunlight warmed his face one last time, and Izuku was excited to see so many more sunrises and sunsets. And this time, they would be real. They spun once more, right off the end of the pier. A short rush of chilly air sped past them and the cold plunge of water enveloped them. The world went silent except for the gurgle of bubbles and the rush of Asami's tail carrying her towards them. She grabbed their hands and pulled them down further and further just as the itchy, rippling agony of their bones crunching struck them. Izuku clung to his mate, and Katsuki buried Izuku's face under his chin. This time, they wouldn't be chained to an anchor in the middle of the ocean. This time, they were entwined in each other's arms. This time, they would be free. Notes. Thank you for reading. Here's some notes to wrap things up. If it wasn't obvious, the dream started when they went to sleep the first night they were in the water Akka, right before they woke up itchy, changing into Mer. Variance was eventually caught and thrown in Tartarus. Sea Snake. Miri was released on good behavior with Aizawa's help, and she got to give her mother that wind chime for her birthday. I may one day write a follow-up to this, but for now, it's just a one-shot lesser than 3. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask me anything if you're more curious about something off-screen.